Hi, everyone. I'm Mike, and today I will speak to you about Velociraptor, which is our DFIR tool that we use for doing a lot of the incident response. Yeah, it's gonna be fun. We're gonna have a bit of a hands-on workshop, and I encourage you guys to try it out, and hopefully everything will kind of work how I planned it, but live demos. So we're gonna pray to the demo God that everything will work fine, and let's just kind of like have a bit of fun. So if anyone has any questions at all, like you can just type them into the chat, or just jump in and just unmute yourself and speak out at any time. It's not really very formal, and if you want me to answer any questions, like just say, right? So it's that's kind of what we're here for. So it's a 4-hour thing, and what I propose we'll do is we'll have a bit of a break every maybe like 40 to 50 minutes, where it sort of makes sense. We'll have like a 10-minute break, then we can switch back. All right, so let's just start. So this also, this slide deck and these exercises are also written by Matt Green as well. So we have, and I'm going to go through his material as well. So we have a lot of hands-on exercise. So let's consider what is Velociraptor. So Velociraptor is actually a really advanced open source DFIR and forensic tool, and it has a lot of capabilities, and we're not really going to be able to cover very many of the capabilities today because just so much. So what we're going to do is, I guess, if you can take a taste, if this workshop gives you a taste of what we can do with Velociraptor, so you can dig further into it and have a look at some of the other capabilities that that come across. So it's going to be pretty quick, and we're just going to like show you a lot of different capabilities, and we're not really going to look into them in too much detail, but follow along and ask me questions. All you need to do for this workshop is just have a VM, a Windows VM. This is going to be a Windows centric workshop. You can download a VM from Microsoft or build your own or whatever. So this is like a clean VM, just nothing's installed. You don't really need to install anything. We're going to go through it all here. Here's a documentation website, which I'll refer to a lot, docs.velociraptor.app. So this is where you'll find the slides under the presentations, and there's all the different slides, slide decks from conferences that we've done, throughout the years. So you can follow along with the slide deck here as well. All right, so we're going to be using a whole bunch of tools today to just illustrate, some of the potential attack techniques. So we're going to really focus on attacks and detection. So some of these tools are illustrating or demonstrating certain types of attacks. There's no malware here. They're just certain tools like time stomping tools and injections and these kind of things. But we will explore some of these. So we can download them by hand, or there's a script I'll point out to later that you can use to download them all at once, save some time. All right, so let's dig into Velociraptor. So what is Velociraptor? So Velociraptor is a unique and free open source DFIR tool. So it's open source, so it's community. The community is community supported. Community is contributing a lot of the logic, a lot of the DFIR capabilities into Velociraptor. But the most important thing with Velociraptor is we have this thing called the Velociraptor Query Language, which is the way that we can write certain kinds of artifacts. And it's a really powerful language sort of a little bit, looks a little bit like SQL. We'll go through it a little bit later. We're not going to really go into VQL very much in this workshop because it's kind of, you know, it's kind of, I consider it more of a medium sort of capability. We'll do a little bit, but to learn about VQL, you can use VQL to then implement a lot of the detections, parsing, and forensic querying that we're doing. So the most important thing is that VQL is kind of like a glue language. It just kind of drives the different capabilities. So for example, we're going to go through this a bit later. We have an NTFS parser, and we have prefetch parsers and registry parsers and so on. And with VQL, we can put them together in new ways. We can say, okay, you know, let's look at this NTFS data stream and extract it and then calculate hashes or do a Yarrow scan. And we can put together these tools and create new detections and new kinds of analysis by joining existing tools. So we'll see that happening a lot. And the idea is that once we write these queries, then we can share them with the community. And we can quickly use those queries to query a large number of hosts at the same time. And you know, we call that a hunt. So with a hunt, we can collect the same artifact over thousands of endpoints in minutes, basically. So it's very, very quick. Let's just have a look at, you know, the architecture, what it looks like. And this is kind of like a very simplified view, but it's actually really simple to deploy. There's really not a lot of moving parts in terms of deployment. All you have to do is deploy a server, Velociraptor server. And I've got it in the cloud. Most of the time we use the cloud, but you can also deploy it on premises. And then we have these things like assets, which we call clients, because this is a server, that's a client. So the clients are servers, laptops, you know, roaming machines, anything like that. We support Windows, Linux, macOS, and FreeBSD, a couple of other operating systems. But they're basically, there's a lot of these, and they're distributed all over the world in, you know, different geographical regions or whatever. And then they connect back to the server using a persistent communication mechanism. And then we have an admin UI, which we will use today, and we can use that admin UI to control you know, run the hunts and do everything like that. But the important thing that is the communication is persistent. So that means that unlike many other tools that, you know, do polling, with Velociraptor, usually it's a persistent connection. So if the machine's online, you can just query it immediately and get the data. So you don't have to wait for it to poll. And so it's actually quite fast to interact with it. So that's kind of like a bit of an overview, high-level overview of what's going on. Now, today we're going to be doing this on our VM. So we're going to be running the server and the admin UI and the assets all on the same computer. But in reality, they'll be all in different places, right? But just for today, we're going to be doing them together. Now, we're not going to really go too much into the deployment. There's a lot of different deployment scenarios and different deployment options. And, you know, this website here, you know, we have the documentation website, and we cover deployments in different ways up here. So you can read that. So today, we're going to be doing a very simple type of deployment. So it'll be very quick. But, you know, basically, the reason that Velociraptor is so fast, so literally we could collect, we could do a hunt on 10,000 machines in, you know, 2 minutes, 5 minutes type thing, and collect all these queries. And the reason that it works so fast is because the server itself doesn't really do all that much. Because we have VQL, then we can use VQL to control. Oh yeah, so the detection lab includes a ready-to-use example of the deployment. Yeah, that's right. But today we're going to be. You don't really need a very complicated deployment scenario because you can just, you know, deploy it in minutes. You know, so it's not like you need a whole bunch of Docker containers and dependencies and stuff like that. You'll see that there's no dependencies really. But the thing that I wanted to explain in this slide is that because VQL is the thing that actually does the heavy lifting, it does all the parsing and all the analysis and the filtering and all that. That happens in VQL, and it happens on the client side, right? So what the server does is it just collects the results and stores them. So it doesn't really do a lot of processing. And that is the reason why we are scaling to a huge number of endpoints. And we can really literally, like, say, parse the prefetch, files from 10,000 endpoints to figure out whether a particular binary ran. Well, that's actually very quick, right? Because there's very little work to be done on the server side. And all we're doing is we're just saying to these 10,000 machines, hey, why don't you run this query? And then the query does the parsing and the heavy lifting and so on. And, we're just going to get back the result set and store them on the server. So the server doesn't really do a lot, and that's why it's very fast. On the client side, we have all the controls because we don't want to overwhelm the endpoint. So we're doing things like CPU throttling and memory controls and various other things. So we'll see that later. So that's why it's fast. Yeah. So to give you an idea of current recommendation is for a single server. I didn't mention this before, but Velociraptor usually uses file-based data store. So it doesn't really have a backend, which is like a MySQL backend or a SQL server or whatever. It doesn't have, it doesn't really run on a database. It just runs on files. So it's very simple to deploy because there's not really any dependencies. We would usually recommend, in the vicinity of 10 to 15,000 endpoints per server, like for the first server. Usually we deploy it on the cloud VM. With 8 gigs, it's probably fine. And if you want to go more than that, you can use TLS offloading. And we've had people going like 40,000 endpoints with one server, but I wouldn't recommend that. That's kind of a lot, right? So above a certain amount, you could go with multi-front-end setup, which is now available. It's one of the deployment options. And we usually run it on a Debian server. Some people want to test it on Windows, and I don't recommend it because I'm not sure that we can get the performance on a Windows server. It's not really well tested. So usually we run a Linux server in the cloud. All right, so that's just kind of like a bit of an overview, and it's time to get our hands dirty. So let's install Velociraptor and then go through the GUI and then try and look. I'm just going to point out some of the interesting capabilities. So I encourage you to try it out. You don't really need a clean VM. Like, you can use whatever VM you want. Velociraptor doesn't really. We're not going to really install it in a permanent way, so you can just delete it afterwards. We're just going to. What we're going to do is create a local server. So we're going to run Velociraptor on our Windows machine locally, and then we can interact with it and use it and so on. And that kind of mode of running it is very useful when you're developing new capabilities. And we'll see how that works, because we can use things like the notebook, which we're going to use later on to run the VQL interactively and experiment with artifacts and so on. So we're going to run it in this way. So all we have to do is download it from our GitHub. So you just kind of like Google Velociraptor GitHub. It's very easy. Velociraptor GitHub. Yep. And that's going to be the first hit. So that's great. And then you just go to the GitHub release. There's a releases page. And at the time right now, the current release is 0.65. And, we do a release, every few months. So that could change in the future, or it will change. And you'll see these here are all our release binaries. So we support a bunch of different platforms. Windows has 2. There's a 32-bit and a 64-bit. We don't really use the 32-bit very much. Just please don't use it if you don't need it. You only really need it very rarely. and it causes a lot of problems if you use it on a 64-bit system, because it doesn't work properly. So if you're running on, usually most of the time, you will be using the Windows AMD 64, which is a 64-bit system. So you just click it, and you'll notice that the extension is a .exe. So we don't actually need to install anything. It's really just an executable. There is also an MSI here, but you don't really use that very often either. Usually use the binaries. So it's not where the Velociraptor is. It's just a single binary, statically linked. So there's no dependencies. You don't really need to install anything else. It's just a single tool that just does everything, right? So the same binary is used for the client, for the server, and all the supporting, tools for managing the deployment and doing various other things, creating packages. You can see that in the documentation. We're not going to go into it too much today, but we have Darwin, two Darwins, and then a Linux one, and this is a Linux Mussel, which is just now in 0.65. It's for very old Linux systems that are outdated. So this one is built to run on very old systems. Right. So anyway, we're going to download our binary. We are on a Windows system, so we'll do the Windows, and then we're just going to open up a command prompt, right click, and say run as administrator. Right. So we're going to be using an administrative prompt here, and I'm just going to go to my downloads folder. I'm just wondering if I can make the font a bit bigger, maybe. Just font. Maybe like this, just so you guys can see it a bit better. There you go. All right, and if I go to my downloads folder, there it is. So I've got my Chrome set up from before, but basically this is my new binary that I've downloaded, right? So I can just run it with no command line arguments, and it will just print the help. It will just like print all these helpful messages. So that is Velociraptor. That's all it is. There's no other files. It is really just an executable, and it does everything. All right. So what we're going to do is we're going to run it in this mode, which is the local server mode. So normally you have a server and a client, as I showed before in the diagram. But today what we want to do is we want to run them together, like one server and one client together. So there is a special mode that we use called the GUI mode, and that brings up essentially a GUI with the server and one client connected to it, so we can interact with the client. And it's like a demo kind of setup, right? So it starts up with a default username and password, but it only listens on the local host. It's only really for local use, right? So it's just like a demo type setup, and that's the one that we use commonly for development and training like we're doing today. So all you have to do is just run Velociraptor GUI. That's it, right? And you'll see that when you do that, it starts up, and it's got a lot of messages and so on. And we're going to open it with Chrome because I'm old school. And you'll see that what happens is it will generate a self-signed SSL certificate. So it's Chrome's complaining a bit and listening on a particular HTTPS and listening on a local port. We're just going to proceed. That's fine. And there we go. So that's Velociraptor. That's basically all we need to install it. And to install it for real doesn't take much more than that. It's actually pretty straightforward. So I'm just going to move that tab over there. And I just wanted to show you the banner. So when we started it, so here's the banner, and it tells us, the build, and it starts a client. So, all right. So now we basically have a Velociraptor server and a Velociraptor client locally, right? So they are just locally. So if we just click the search, show all, this is the search bar, right? So we are able to search for clients that are attached. show all, we should be able to see the client. Oh, sorry, I have to unstick the terminal. All right, so we have one client, so it's not a big deployment, right? Just one client. You need credentials. Okay, so yes, well, you can see the username is admin, so it's just admin password. So it's not super secure, but it's only listening locally, right? It's just for the demo. So if your browser refuses to take the credentials from the URL, then you have to know this, like admin password, right? So yeah, cool. So you see, this is the user setting, right? And yeah, so when we search, we have only one client connected to this machine. So later on we'll connect lots more clients, so you'll see like what it looks like for a decent sized deployment. But right now we only have backup a minute. Yep. Okay, cool. All right, so we could just, have you got, is it working for you? Do you have yeah, I'm just going to go through the where you started Chrome. Okay, so I actually didn't need to start Chrome, because when you start the GUI, it starts Chrome by itself. So all you do is you just run this command, right? Velociraptor GUI, right?
Yeah, I got that part, and like then Chrome pops up.
Yep.
So I'm on the Velociraptor page. So what am I supposed to do after that?
Ah, right. So you're on the welcome page. So that's the welcome page. Is that right? Yeah.
Yes.
Cool. So that's fine. That's where we need to be right now, because now what I'm going to do is just walk through the UI and just kind of like point out different parts of the UI, right?
Okay.
So that's the welcome page. Sorry.
Thank you.
No worries. Yeah. Okay. So that's the welcome page. So before we even start, because I know that everybody likes this is the default colors, right? So it's kind of like it's not too bad, but when you're using Velociraptor all the time, it's kind of boring. And this is like the vanilla boring look. I don't know. So if you click on your little user, this is like the user tile up here, then you can have the user settings. That's the different settings that each user can choose. So you can have lots of users, of course, right? On the we're logging with admin, and you can just play around with some themes, right? And change the theme. So there's a light theme or a dark theme, depending on preferences. And then there's different themes you can play around with, right? Different colors and so on. Probably my favorite. Oh, there's like a retro theme. Anyway, we can have fun with that. And there's even a pink one. I don't mind the pink one. It's actually quite nice once you get used to it. But first thing is a little bit too pink. But it's actually quite a nice one. But today, what am I going to use? I will use this one, which is a light theme, but it's a little bit more flatter colors. So anyway, you guys choose whatever theme you want, right? It's part of the. Oh, and you can also change the languages, right? Like if you want to change to a different language, like German or whatever. Anyway, this is just yeah. Okay, so these are just user settings. And actually, I'll have to say this is per user, right? So each user can choose whatever settings they want. These ones are more of a usability thing, but I just wanted to point out there's a couple of forensically relevant settings for the user. The first one is that, well, this one is the time zone. And with Velociraptor GUI, we show the times, all times, and forensics is all really about times, right? So we show them in the UTC time zone by default. But sometimes, depending on the case, right, a different time zone would make more sense, right? So for example, like, if we change to Sydney, then it will change the UI to use Sydney times. And that makes, that's useful when you're working a case in Sydney, right? So that's one of the user settings. The other user setting that's important is you can specify a password for downloads, and we'll see that. So, like sometimes you download something and it's like password infected or whatever, right? So you might have malware in it, right? And if you have like in your browser, you might have, virus scanner or whatever. And, then every time you download something from Velociraptor, it will, get upset and quarantine, and it will be kind of bad. So you can just go in here and put in like a password, infected, whatever. And then it will just, generate all the downloads will become encrypted with this password so that, the virus scanner doesn't get upset. But so there are the sort of user settings here. So anyway, so this is our welcome screen. So the first thing that I wanted to show you is the search capability. So before we can interact with the client, so as I said, the endpoints are called clients. Before we can interact with the client, we have to search for it. So we have to find it basically. And over here we have show all. This is the search bar. So you can search, based on, I'll show you. But let's just start off with clicking the show all. And all it does is it just, puts the search term all, in there. So you can actually just also type it, doesn't matter. And that shows you all the clients. Now, of course, it's not all the clients because usually you'll have like 10, 20,000 clients or 50,000 clients. So it's just going to like page through it, but it just shows you like some clients, right? And this is what a client looks like, right? In the UI. So clients, they have a client ID, and the client ID starts with a C and it has like a number, random like number here. So each client has an ID. That's how Velociraptor internally identifies each client separately, right? Using this ID. And then we've got like host name and always and this kind of thing. And this green thing tells us if the client is online or offline. So if it's not online, then it will be red or yellow or whatever, like depending on how recently it was online. And then over here, you have something called labels, and we can label a client. And I'll show you how we can use that to target specific clients. So what we might do is we might label it right now. So I'm just going to highlight this client and click the label button here, label. And I can choose a new label. So for example, I might just say, that's a developer machine, for example, right? And add it. I'm going to add. Okay, and then you can see that now it has a label called developer. So we can use labels actually to search for machines and to target them in hunts and these kind of things. So over here now, when you want to type into the search, you can type label, right? And then you can see all the labels and select the label, so that will search for that label. So you can imagine if you have hundreds of machines. Actually, we'll have more machines later. So then we can label them. You can see how that works a bit better. But that's just kind of like the manual way of labeling. But of course, you can use VQL to label it, to label machines, in a more efficient way, because there are usually thousands of machines that you need to label. So we don't really do it through the GUI that much, but sometimes. So like, a label would be like compromised, right? Oh, if you click the label, it will remove it, right? So don't click it. So it'll be like compromised, right? Or something like that. So you can basically start to, triage your machines, as you go along. Let me see what, so I've got actually here, the slides, and I just talk over it. So I'm just going to go back to the slides to see if I've missed something. And then I'll go back to the demo. Oh yeah, so when we run it with the GUI command, what happens is it stores the data in the temp directory. So that's fine for, temporary. But if you wanted to do a more permanent storage, you can specify data store directory. So we'll go there. Because the temp directory gets deleted all the time, so it's kind of annoying. Yes, so okay, so I said that. It starts a temporary client server, self-signed SSL, and hard-coded admin password. We cover that. And now we're doing a GUI tour. And we're showing the dashboard. Oh, why they haven't shown the dashboard? So I haven't done it in order. So this is the welcome screen that we've seen before. Now over here on the left side, we have the nav bar, navigation, and we have the home nav bar, which is the dashboard. right? So we call it like the dashboard. And this is where you kind of see just a bit of an overview about the server. And, for example, the server version, very important. So you know what the version is. All the users on the server, on this server. So at the moment, there's only an admin user, but you can also have different users, and you can see, you can give them different roles and permissions, like, they don't all have to be admins, right? And then you can see how much disk space. So this is important to tell how much free disk space you have. Because Velociraptor is really fast, then what happens is, if sometimes, especially when users are kind of new to Velociraptor and they're not used to it, they sometimes are over ambitious, in how much they collect. So, like, for example, like if I said, oh, I want to get the MFT from, from all of my machines, right? And your typical MFT might be 500 megs, which is, a reasonable size, but it's not huge, right? So for one, it's not too bad. But then, if you're doing a hunt and you collect the MFT and it's going to be 10,000 machines, you're just going to swamp your server, and it's really fast. So it's going to just push all that data, and you're going to run out of disk space, like in hours, within a couple of hours, you can fill up a terabyte, right? If you have a cloud machine, right, with lots of bandwidth. So, so keep an eye on the disk space, important. And so that's why it's in the dashboard. And then over here, what we can see is the, just statistics of the server. So here we say how much memory we use on the server. At the moment, because we just started it and it's a very small server, it is really using 67 megabytes, which is not a lot. And how much CPU the server is using, and how many front ends we've got, which is only one right now. But when you have a lot more clients, and a bigger deployment, I mean, you're probably looking at, a few hundred megabytes. Yeah, a few gigabytes. So 8 gigs is more than enough for most deployments. And then over here, we've got the total number of clients. So because we only have one now, because this is how it comes, but we'll do more later. Cool. So that's the dashboard. Yeah, so we can see that. We've seen that. This is what it looks like, when you have more, active deployment, because, because people tend to kind of shut the machines down and go home, and so it's kind of like it does this kind of like day-night cycle type thing. And here we've got the utilization over time, and depending if you're doing like hunts or whatever, then it might go up for a bit and then go down, like that kind of thing. All right, so what I'm going to show you now is just like how you would use Velociraptor to interactively investigate individual clients. And that's kind of like the entry level, like it's just like many of the other tools that have interactive capability. You just kind of like reach out and interact with the client. So first of all, we have to search for it, which we've covered. So we can click the show all. And type it in here, and then here's what it looks like, where some of the clients are not haven't been online for a while, so they turn red. So it's important to know when the client is available, so you can interactively interact with it. Otherwise, you can schedule collections for it, so when it comes on, then it will do them, right? And so you don't have to wait for it to actually be online. You can actually schedule stuff ahead, and then it will get done when it comes back online. You can search for host names. I've shown the label, but you can also search for host name, just type host, and go through the different host name and things like that. MAC addresses, other things like that, IP address label, these kind of things. So this is just the usual stuff. Yeah, we talked about the client ID. Oh, so once we search for it, we click on the client ID, and that goes to the host overview page, right? So this is just kind of like a host overview. We can see things like, the labels, when it was last seen, when it was first seen. If you hover your mouse on it, you've noticed that I've changed it to Sydney time zone. So, remember that I did that before. But otherwise it's in UTC. And if you hover on it, it tells you like a more useful thing, like, that's, a few minutes ago. So, like that's a little bit easier to see. And then over here, we've got some things that we can do with these clients. So I'm just going to go through. This is the overview. So that's what we're looking at now. And if you click on the VQL drill down, then you see like information about the client, about the endpoints. So a bit more information here, particularly the version of the client. It's important. And in Velociraptor, we use the build time to tell us exactly which version it's running. So it tells us when it was built. So it's a pretty recent one. And then the MAC addresses, various things. So this is just kind of like what we collect. And over here, we see a memory and CPU footprint. So when we are running clients, Velociraptor clients, right? You can imagine that these clients are running on, CEO machines and, important people's machines, right? So we are really careful that we don't want to overload these machines, and we don't want to, if we need to do an IR, we have the option of, taking priority, right? But generally, we can do these remote forensic tasks and control the level of use of the CPU and memory. And in order to know, that we are performing within spec, then we also collect telemetry about our footprint, with time. So this is kind of what it's showing, how much, memory and CPU percentage that the client is using on the endpoint, right? So it sort of like goes over time, and we can see if there's a spike. Usually you'll see, like, if you do a hunt, there'll be a bit of a spike and it will go down. And depending on what you're doing, like you can imagine you're doing like huge Yarrow scan, it could take a lot of resources, right? So you have to always be mindful as well about the impact that you're going to impart on the endpoint. And there's some other information, and these are the users on this machine and other things like that. So that's cool, right? The next one along is a shell. So this is basically, we can run arbitrary shell commands, which is useful in an IR situation, but we try not to use it too much because it's kind of like a powerful tool, right? And we can run it with PowerShell or command, or we can just run straight out VQL commands. So let's see, with PowerShell, we might do something like, I had an example here. Let me just, get local group member administrator, right? So this is like, you're just running a PowerShell command, like to get all the local administrators, get local group members. So we can type that, get local group members, member dash group admin list. I think it has to be quotes. Is that right? Administrators. No, sorry, don't want to mess it up. Yeah, so this is basically a typical PowerShell command, and I'm just going to launch it. And you'll see that what it does is it will go out to the endpoint and run this PowerShell. And over here, we can see the results when it's done. Hope I typed it right. Yeah. So it tells us all the users that belong to the administrator group, right? So which is important, So this is an example of kind of like ad hoc PowerShell type things that are useful to run. So I mean, a lot of EDRs and things like that have this kind of feature. We try not to use it too much because it's not really easy to control what is happening, and there's not a lot of auditing going on. So there is auditing here because I can see that who ran it and when, things like that. But we try not to, because if I mistype this, then it could delete the whole system, right? Like it doesn't have as much control. So try not to use it too much, but it's useful sometimes. All right, so that's the shell. So we've seen that, and because DFIR is all about fetching files and things like that. So we want to sometimes fetch files from the endpoint. So if we click on the VFS tab here, then it's going to take us to the VFS, which it's actually just the same. You can go there here as well, the virtual file system. And the virtual file system is just a server cache of of what we know about, in the client. Of course, the source of truth is always the client's file system, but this is like a UI that we can use to kind of interrogate the client to say, oh, what's this directory? What does this directory contain? And things like that. And it's kind of a familiar, it's a more familiar, interface to just kind of fetch, directory listings and files from the endpoint. So so when we first start off, the server doesn't really know anything about the endpoint, right? So we don't really, we're waiting for the user to tell us what to do, right? So you'll see that this directory is empty. So over here, the first thing we see is auto, which auto is, these are called accesses, which we'll talk about later. But auto means that it's just goes out to look at files using the API. So if I just click this button here, which is refresh this directory, right? Then what it will do is it will go out to the endpoint and list the directory. So the top level of the auto is just all the drives, like C drive, D drive, these kind of things. So then, in each level, I'm just going to go in and it will list that directory and show me the next, the next level down. And so you can see that when I click on the users, there's no data available and I have to refresh the directory. So it's just showing me like what the server knows about it. So this is important to understand. You're not going to the endpoint. You're just looking at, the server cache, and then you have to kind of tell the endpoint to, refresh itself, sync itself. Now, if you're going to go and click all these things, it's kind of tedious, takes a while. So we can do a recursive refresh, and that will just kind of like go down and sync all the files here, 3,000, 5,000. And it just does like a recursive directory listing. And so now we can, we don't have to do that, right? So it's just all about, you can do that from the top level, but it will take a long time. So, and it will sync a lot of files. It's kind of a trade-off, right? You'd probably like, normally I just go like 1 or 2 levels in and then just do a recursive. Like that's fine too. But that basically refreshes that sync. Now, we have the test directory. And we're basically looking through all the files here, right? So we can see, like that's a symlink, right, somewhere, and that's the directory and so on. That's the NT-user dat, right? And as we're going to see that later. So you see, this is the NT-user dat. Now, for the test user. So normally, that NT-user dat is locked when the user is logged in, right? So you can't usually just read it using the APIs. So you can read other files using the API, but in the case of NT-user, it's locked. Now, because we are in the auto part of the directory listing, then it will use an automatic way. It will automatically try and get that file. So when I click collect from the client, so I'm going to click that, it's going to download this file. So even though it's locked, what it will do is it will basically fall back to, it will say, it will use the API, try and get it. It will say, no, access denied or whatever. And then it will just say, okay, I'm going to just parse the NTFS and extract it by itself. So usually you don't need to really worry about forgetting files. You don't really need to use the API, the NTFS parser explicitly, because it will automatically use that if it can't access the file. So now you can see, we've got like the registry file and it's like the raw registry file. So this is kind of like how you would collect it manually, but you never really do that. This is, I think the VFS is mostly used for just like finding your way around the place and, looking at 1 or 2 files, but generally you don't collect a lot of files this way. It's just too, you've got hashes and stuff. It's not as efficient, right? You can actually just download the file that we've just collected, because once we've collected it, we have a little, download icon. We can see when it was collected, so we know, how recent or how fresh that file is, and so on. So we can actually just like click on that, it will, download it. We can use RegRipper or whatever on this is a registry file, so we can parse it using another tool or whatever. But Yeah, so that's kind of like the UI for the VFS. Let's see, what have we covered? So yeah, so we covered recursively listing there. Oh, you can also recursively download all the files, which is not a huge idea. Oh, well, maybe. So, you know, like if you have the downloads directory and you're like, okay, I want all these files, then you can click on that and it will recursively download it. But it might fill up all of disk. So yeah. What else is there? Oh, so yeah, click that, collect from clients. And then remember that really what it's doing is it's just remembering on the server that you collected these things. So that file is not necessarily up to date with you know, with the client, right? So you might have to recollect it from the client, you know, to get the freshest data. Yeah, so we covered all that. And oh, this is so this was the auto part, right, which uses the file system APIs. There's also the NTFS part. So the NTFS part uses the NTFS parser to look at the file system. So it's sort of similar, but a little bit different. Because we're using the NTFS parser, you'll see that the drives, they sort of look more like // you know, C drive. This is the device name because we're looking at raw devices. We're actually just kind of parsing the raw device. And then you'll see that if you use that, then you'll now start to see these dollar files. And these files are actually NTFS specific files. And we're going to cover that later. And I guess you guys all know about NTFS, but you got like the MFT and the mirror and you know, various other things. And then the other cool thing that you'll notice is you'll sometimes see these little clock things here. And that's basically the UI trying to indicate to you that this file or directory may be time stomped. So we're not going to cover time stomping too much in this workshop, but basically it's just kind of looking at the dates and saying, oh, you know, like it's just your usual, you know, birth time is, you know, before or after the end time. Because you see that the MFT timestamps, they come from a number of different streams in the MFT. We'll talk about, no, we won't talk about it in this workshop. About specifically the times. We'll talk about other things in NTFS later. And you can see that some of them come from the file name, right? And then some of them come from the standard information, and standard information one is, you know, it might be out of like before, you know, if the standard information one is before the birth time, the file name, that you know, it might be timestamp. So this is the UI for that. Yeah, so we've done that. Okay, cool. All right, so that's cool. So we talked about how we can interactively look at the remote machine, but so far, you know, this is just kind of like a fancy Explorer, like Windows Explorer or whatever. Like you can just look at different things. It's not that exciting. You know, you can get particular files. I mean, it's already really useful because you can do it remotely to any machine, but it's very manual and it's really like not very efficient. Like, you know, for example, if I said, oh, I want to get all the event log files, well, I'll have to like click through, you know, Windows and event logs and try and find them. And then there'll be like, you know, many directories, and I'll have to know where to look for it. You know, if I want to get the event log files, where do I want to find them? And you know, and then go and find them, right? So it's not very efficient. And so really, in case of Velociraptor, the most important thing that you know, in Velociraptor, as we mentioned, is having this query language. And with this query language, we can actually control how Velociraptor does the analysis. So we can get different information each time. And that is really important because we can dynamically adapt. So for example, let's say there's a new IOC or a new kind of analysis or a new type of file or whatever. And then we want to add support for this file. Even file parsing is done with VQL, right? So if you want to parse a new kind of file, then you can say, you don't really need to write the new code, compile it, push it out. You can just write new VQL query, and it will pass this thing, right? So you basically, write an artifact and off you go. So the turnaround from an ISC to a hunt, usually a few minutes if you are, after a bit of practice, right? And you can actually hunt for these ISCs, like, log4j, came out, and we quickly wrote an artifact and deployed it and got all the vulnerable software, these kind of things. And then we can exchange these queries, the VQL queries, with in the form of artifacts with the community. And we have an artifact reference here, so you can see on the website. We're going to talk about that later, but there's something called the artifact exchange, where people can contribute artifacts, which these are all different queries, right? And these are all the contributors, and they all do something slightly different. But whatever people find useful, then we can share that with the community. So that's kind of what the query language enables us to do. So what I'm going to do now is we'll do a little pause, because we're coming up to the hour, and maybe we'll do, like, I don't know, 5-minute pause or 10-minute pause, maybe five minutes. And then we'll just go through, we're not going to go too much into VQL, but just to give you an idea of what it looks like. And then we'll continue on with our GUI tour. All right. Now, if you have any questions during this break or whatever, just don't hesitate to ask me. Otherwise, we'll be back in 5-ish minutes, 5 minutes, let's say. All right. Cool. Thanks. All right. So welcome back. So how do we exchange these queries with the community? We call the queries, we have something called an artifact. So I just pointed to the artifact exchange here. And an artifact looks kind of like this, right? It's a YAML file, and it has a name. That's the name of the artifact. Has a description, type, and it takes some parameters, as you can see, and then it has the queries. So this is where the VQL queries go, right? And then we can use the parameters to kind of influence those queries or control them in some way. So so it's very so this is kind of like a structure, and this whole thing is called an artifact, because we use that to fetch or get a particular type of forensic artifact. So for example, if we wanted to look at so these are all the user contributed artifacts. And Velociraptor comes with a whole bunch of built-in artifacts as well, but these are the community ones as well. So you can see, for example, like this one, RDP client activity. If we click on that, we will see, there's the description. It tells us, which is up here as well, it tells us, what it does. This particular query happens to look through the RDP terminal services log, and then get parse it and present it in a more usable way. And a lot of the time, that's what artifacts do. You see, this one just contains a lot of information, enrichments, these kind of things. so you can see that these see this is a particular detection for a particular CVE, and a CVE comes out, and we say, how do we detect whether we have vulnerable software? And we can just quickly write an artifact, pull that out, go over the entire fleet, send it all to all our machines, and then off we go, right? So we're not going to go into the details of like, you can see that this is a SQL-like language. It's not exactly SQL. It's much more powerful than SQL, but it looks very familiar. So if you've ever done SQL, it's fairly familiar. And I've just got a slide here just to sort of show you roughly like the main parts of a query, so you can know what it looks like. So it's SQL-like, so it looks like SQL. Starts with select. And then we have something called column selectors. So they're just the columns that we want to have. And because it's a query, it always returns a table. So it has columns and rows, right? And then we have this thing called, so we have a from, and then we have a plugin. In SQL, this would be a table. So it'd be like select something from a table, right? But because VQL isn't really a database, it's actually running these data sources. So these are basically plugins that are code. They run like, they're functions. They run code, and that code generates the data. So it's not really a static table like in SQL, and therefore we need to be able to pass parameters to that. So that's why VQL's extended, above the SQL syntax to allow plugins to receive arguments, right? So that's kind of one of the major differences between SQL and VQL, but it sort of makes sense. And then we have a where clause, and then we have a filter condition. So it's basically similar sort of thing. All right, so Velociraptor, when you think about it, is just really a VQL engine. It's just, you just talk to it, you run a query, it collects the query, and that's really all it is. The client, the server, that's all it does. VQL is used everywhere. And the artifact is just how we package that. So we covered that. All right, so let's have a look at what happened in the UI. So you can see that here, when I clicked throughout the UI, and I looked through the virtual file system, downloaded files, etc., what actually was going on when I did that? What was happening? So if I just switch to the collected artifacts tab down here, then you'll see that what actually was happening is that I was collecting these different artifacts from the endpoint. And in fact, the only thing that clients can do is collect artifacts. That's really all it is. So we are running queries. The only thing that clients can do is run queries. So whenever we interact with the client at all, we're just running a query on the client and we get the results. So really clients, this is why I said the Velociraptor is a VQL engine, just runs a query and returns the results. So when I was clicking through the UI before, see, remember how I ran the PowerShell before? Well, what was it doing? It was running an artifact called Windows System PowerShell. Let's look at that. If you recall, before I was I ran this command, get local group member. This is the PowerShell command that I ran. So you can see that there is an artifact called Windows System PowerShell. I can click on that and get some information, about this artifact. So I've got some explanations, but you see that it has a parameter. It takes the parameter. The parameter is what is, in this case, it's the PowerShell command to run, and we can pass it. And this is what I was passing to it. So I ran that. So you can see that this artifact, the UI is just generating these collections. It's just collecting these artifacts as I click through. And the same thing is happening to the VFS. So this directory, I was listing the different directories. You can see which directories I was listing, see users. Downloading a file, I can see I downloaded that file with the auto accessor. This GUI was just essentially packaging this up. So let's have a look at one of the list directory examples. Now over here on this side, you can see that we have megabytes and rows. So these are artifacts, and these are called artifact collections, right? So we're collecting these artifacts, or the old name for it, or like interchangeable name is a flow, right? But I think a collection is a bit more clearer. So what we're doing is we're doing a collection here, and you can see that collections can return rows, or bytes, right, or bulk data. So that's really the only thing that a query can do, is it can collect rows, because the query just returns, rows, and also we can collect bulk data. So in this case, because we're downloading the file, we collected 1 row and 1 megabytes, right? This was when we downloaded the NT-user that. And if we look at the uploaded files, then we'll see that we uploaded 2 files, ntuser.dat, and this is the index file, because ntuser.dat is usually sparse. So we have a sparse file as well. And then these are the requests that were sent. So you can see that we're sending queries to the endpoint. And then this is the rows that return the results. So actually, if we look at this one, we can see these are the rows that are returned from the VFS list directory artifact. So you can see that comes back, and we can page through that or whatever. So this is really very important to understand that we either have rows and or bytes transferred. Now, every time we run a query on the endpoint, the query generates logs. So basically, we want to know what's going on, right, with this query. And queries can generate a log, a query log. So it's basically logging to us what's going on as it's working. So we can tell that it starts the query execution, at this time, and then it's transferring, the rows, right, and then it's finished, right. So if there was like an error or something like that, then we will also see that in the logs, right. So it will tell us what's going on, in that case. Here's a PowerShell, and you can see that it actually ended up executing. The PowerShell encoded the command and ran this thing, which we told it, right? So that's how it works, right? And then we got some query stats here, which just tell us like statistics about the query, like how many rows it scanned and these kind of things. All right, so that is the artifacts. We can tell the duration, how long it took in the overview, like how long it took, whether it's finished. And over here, we've got, these are the resource controls on the query. As I mentioned before, we are very careful to control the amount of resources that we use on the endpoint. And we will see in a minute how we can control that. So, yeah, and these are the parameters. We've mentioned that, and we talked about the rows and the megabytes. Okay, cool. So the whole point of having artifacts is that someone had figured out a query that is useful from an operational or forensic purposes, and then we can share that with everyone else, right? So it's all about sharing knowledge and being able to foster a community where we can exchange this knowledge. And usually, most users, they don't really care about. You can think about DFIR or forensics as a science that is really designed to answer questions, but the questions that we are trying to answer is not really about the science itself. It's a much higher level question. So for example, like if I'm looking at prefetch files, right? Well, why am I looking at prefetch files? Because I want to know whether something executed, right? Why do I want to, so the question is, did something execute? Did this program execute? And how I get that information is by looking at prefetch files. But really, I don't care about the prefetch files. All I care about is my question, did something execute, right? So this is, it's important to think about it in terms of high-level questions. And then the artifact is simply the mechanical way of how do we answer this question of information to support these theories, right? So that's kind of, I like to think about it when I write an artifact, because we're not really writing forensic artifacts for the sake of the forensics. I mean, it's fun and everything, parsing files and so on, but at the end of the day, we really want to know about, the answers that they give us. So so the artifacts are about answering questions. So let's go back and have a look at what does an artifact look like. So over here, we have something called the view artifacts. And inside Velociraptor, we have something called the artifact repository, which is just artifacts that it knows about, that the server knows about. So these are all the built-in ones that you can see. These are different built-in artifacts. They do all different things, and we can search for them and so on. Like we can search for IP, or like this one, RDP auth, or event log, EVTX files. There's an EVTX hunter that's really super useful. These kind of things. And this basically tells us, oh, so these are all the artifacts that we know about. So there's a bit of a description here, and parameters and so on. But just because, so Velociraptor comes with a bunch of built-in artifacts that are ready to use straight out of the box. But if you want to customize them or change them in some way, you can just you can add a whole new one, or you can simply edit an existing artifact. Let me just make that font a little bit bigger so you can see it. Yeah. So you can click this little spanner to change the fonts and stuff. And you can see that when I edit an artifact, then it customizes it. So it changes the name to make it a custom version of the artifact. And I can go ahead and change that VQL a little bit. Sometimes the built-in artifacts are almost what we want, but we want something a little bit different. Maybe we want to filter by more conditions or whatever, right? So then it's just a question of taking an existing artifact and changing it just a little bit, maybe adding another clause to the where clause, or another condition or whatever. And so we can just do that stuff, and then when we click save, then we'll see that we now have a customized version of this artifact. And you can see it's customized because it has that little user customized icon, and you cannot delete a built-in one, right? So that's like grayed out. But you can delete, a customized one. So the built-in ones, you can't really change them because they're built-in, but you can update them, and the name changes, of course, then to a custom. You can change the name to whatever you want, but convention it says custom. But and then that's how you can customize these artifacts. So the idea is that artifacts are very pliable. You can change them. You can you can write your own from scratch, but a lot of the time you can just modify an existing one. All right, so now we're going to look at collecting an artifact. And in this case, we're going to do the task scheduler. And as you know, in Windows, task scheduler is a really common way for having persistence. So people, ransomware groups, they go in, they install the malware, and then they introduce some tasks sometimes in the task scheduler that allow you to that basically reinfect the machine a little bit later on. So we're gonna try and collect the tasks from the task scheduler here. So we go back to our collected artifacts screen from this one client, and these collections, if you recall, were generated by the UI automatically, but we're going to do a new one manually. So we click on that little plus thing here, and that's new collection. So we create a new collection. And we're going to look at task scheduler. So we just search for task, this task scheduler one. So when I highlight it, then I can see, the same thing that I've seen before, just a bit of explanation about it. And you can see that what it actually does is it parses the XML files, and pulls out the important information in that. And then we have these parameters. So I'm just going to, this one is just like an overview. And I can actually choose several artifacts to collect at the same time, but I'm just going to do the one now. So the next one along, configure parameters. All right. So now here's where we configure the parameters for this collection. If you just, because you can have several, then you can have, multiple of these, but we'll open that one up. And this particular artifact supports the following parameters. Tasks path, which is basically where to find those XML task files, but that's the default. And you see it has a default, which is sensible. So that's the default in Windows, right? Basically, So it knows already where to find those things. So unless you really need to change it, you don't really need to change it, right? And then the other thing that we can do is also upload. So that basically says, are we should we also upload the raw XML files, or just parse them and just want to see the results, right? So if I tick that, then it will also upload. Otherwise, it doesn't. So that's cool. So we've done that. And then the next step along is to specify resources. So as I mentioned before, we can control the resources of collections. And this one, how much CPU limits and how long to take. By default, 600 seconds are allowed. And then the query is timed out and canceled. So we can cancel a query actively, right? So if sometimes, like for example, you can imagine I'm doing a big MFT search or a big Yara scan or whatever, and it just takes too long. I happen to be less targeted than I want to be, and in that case, it will time out, and I want to cancel that because my query is no good, right? So that's what that is. And then specify. So these are all about resource limits and controlling resources. So they're the defaults, but okay, don't change them for right now. We just review it. This is what the request is gonna, you can use that API for that. And then just click launch, off it goes, right? So because the client is immediately connected, it will be tasked immediately and off we go. So you can see that it ran this query on the endpoint and collected 202 rows and also uploaded 600 kilobytes because I actually said also collect those XML files. So yeah, so I uploaded 200 files, those 200 XML files. If I look at the logs, this is the query log, and it will tell me, what it's done. So that's the usual thing. And then the results. So the results, again, the query that ran, it parses those XML files and it tells me the important things that I want to know out of it is the command, arguments, and so on, right? So I can, be able to see whether, there's any like malicious tasks or whatever, right? So that's, we're going to look at that in more details later. Yeah, we've covered that. We've covered the rows and so on, how long it took. We done that. And the upload, because I said to upload the XML files, I can actually just immediately select each of those XML files if I wanted just one out of the collection. Or alternatively, if I did this whole collection, I can actually generate a download, and it will make like a zip file that contains all of this data in that zip file. Let's see what that looks like. And this is the thing that I mentioned before, that you can change the password for that because it might contain malware, right? So if we open the zip file, then we can see that the data inside of it is kind of like separated out for, in a particular structure. But we can see all the uploads in there, right? And it kind of tries to follow more or less the, the file system, structure. So these are all the tasks that came from C Windows System 32 tasks and so on. So it just kind of creates these kind of uploads. And this is useful when we collect a ton of data, right? So, yeah, so we covered that. And we looked at the log query, which is important to see if there's any errors or whatever. In this case, it's possible to have multiple sources. Yeah, so that's the analysis side, right? We did an analysis, but sometimes you can have multiple sources inside each artifact. So you can use that to choose which table to look at. So we showed the download, we prepared the download, downloaded the download, and we look at the data. This is okay. We collected some cape file targets here. We're going to talk about that later. All right, so this is kind of the point of VQL, right? We have all these forensic tools, capabilities, and we join them together in new ways, and that's why VQL is super powerful. So there is, NTFS, MFT, USN, all these usual forensic type parsers and tools that you are used to, but they're all available inside this query language so that you can actually put them together in cool ways. So there are several different types of artifacts. We're not going to go into it yet. We'll cover some client artifacts later, client event artifacts. The ones that we looked at so far are client artifacts, which are just collecting things from the client, right? There's also event artifacts, and we can also collect things from the server as well. So we can run VQL on the server as well. And we can also run VQL server event artifacts, which I don't think we are going to cover today. But anyway, because we have open source community, we have the exchange, so we can check it out. So check out the exchange later and see what's available. There's really some pretty cool, impressive stuff in the artifact exchange contributed by the community. And chances are, if there's a new vulnerability or new CV or new attack or a new something, then it will pretty quickly have an artifact on the exchange, because people are hunting for these things all the time. So you can see that the exchange actually has a bunch of stuff which we've seen, but you can actually just copy each one like separately, right? But it's kind of like tedious, right? There's a lot of stuff, like, so you can go in here and you're like, oh, I want to do this guy, copy it from here, go into there, create a new artifact. I could delete it, paste it, and create it. So we can do that manually, but it's if you only need one or two, probably I'll do it manually. But otherwise, it's just too annoying, right, to do that. So what we really want to do is to just pull this whole thing out, suck it all in, right? So we have a quick way of doing that. What we're going to do is we're going to run a query on the server. So it's going to be a server artifact. So we can select server artifact. So a server artifact is exactly the same like a client artifact, except we're collecting it from the server. So we're still going to, so we're running these VQL queries on the server. And in this case, we're going to click the plus. So we're going to add a new collection, and we're going to search for and exchange the artifact exchange. And this one is a server import artifact exchange. So it's one query that imports all the artifacts from the artifact exchange. And you can see that we have, it takes as a parameter the URL, the exchange URL, which is just, so it's just a zip file. And if you wanted to maintain your own, like your own repository of artifacts, then you can just change that to your own GitHub or something else, right? So you can still use the same artifact to import your own set. But yeah, basically the defaults get it from the Velociraptor artifact exchange. So if we just click launch, then it just goes off and it runs the query and downloads the all the artifacts from the exchange. It just kind of like loads them up into the into the server, and you can see that it's done 60 rows. So if we look at that, and all of the artifacts have been loaded. So now, once we've run this, if we go back to our artifact repository with view artifacts, then we should be able to see a bunch of exchange ones, right? So these are all the ones from the exchange. So there's like a bunch of them, right? And so these are all the ones, they're the same thing, but it's just a quick way of just loading them, right? So all these ones, right? So so it's just a quick way of getting them. So it's useful to know that. All right, so let's start to do some forensic-y stuff, right? So that was like UI tour, and we saw what's going on in the UI. But let's start to do some more interesting forensic-y stuff. That's kind of like juicy stuff, right? So in forensics, the first step of most things is searching for files. A lot of the time, our forensic jobs are like, let's find the file. Like where is the malware? Where is the Word document with the macro, and where is the whatever, right? So we're just going to look for files, And, it sounds simple, searching for files, but it's actually kind of a very powerful technique. And it's really challenging to do at scale, because not only do we want to search for files in DFIR on one machine, we want to search for the files on thousands of machines, because the question might be, which machine had this particular file, or which machine was infected with this virus, or which machine had this particular IP, whatever, right? So we want to be able to do it in a distributed way, and that's where the power of Velociraptor comes in. So we need to search by file content sometimes by file name. There's a whole bunch of different things that we might want to look. So the file finder, this is the artifact that we are going to look at now, is like the Swiss Army knife for finding files, right? It's basically it's basically what we need for finding files, and it tries to be balanced, very, very quick performance, as well as having lots of features, like lots of different filters and different things that we can search files with. And what it does is, depending on the features, it will try and use the most efficient way possible. But of course, the more constraints we put on the files, then of course it's going to go slower because it has to do more checks. But well, let's take a look. So you can see that, for example, we could let's just do an example here. All right, so we're going to add a file finder, and we're going to just search for the finder, and we'll have the Windows one. So this is the Windows one. So if we go to parameters, configure parameters, and then here we've got a whole bunch of parameters that we can choose. We can filter the files by. So we can look for files by glob, and also we can have like a table with lots and lots of different globs. So we can search for different places. So glob is just like a wildcard type thing. We can change the accessor. We'll talk about that later. Or we can even do a Yarrow rule. We can create a Yarrow rule so that we can filter by file content as well. So we can search the content of files using this Yarrow rule. Now, once we find the file, and then we can upload it or hash it. We can also use like dates to limit the dates or times, these kind of things. And so this is basically most of the time, that's kind of what we want to do, is just try to find files. So we did have an exercise, right? So find all the executables in the user's home directory. Right, so here we have the user's home directory, C users. And let's say we want to find all the executables in the user's home directory. So we want to recurse into the home directory. So we want to go into subdirectories and subdirectories. And this is where the wildcards in Velociraptor are a little bit more powerful than just what you're used to. We can use ** instead of 1 star. We'll do 2 stars, and 2 stars means recursive search. So when we do a directory with a ***, that means it's going to recursively look at all the subdirectories and subdirectories, right, all the way down. Well, not all, but I think by default it like goes down 30 levels or something like that. So a lot anyway. And then we're going to say *.exe, right? So we're going to search for all the executables that have a .exe, extension. I can restrict it by dates and times or whatever, but in this exercise, we're just gonna search for them. I'm not gonna upload them. I just want to see them, right? So off I go. So this is basically how what we call globbing, or searching by wildcards, does. Is it basically goes through and it globs. This is the wildcard expression, the glob expression, and it found 35, in this case, 35 files. We can look at the results. These are all the executables. We've downloaded a few, and then we've got a few in the Chrome software repository tool, and we can go on and look through other executables, basically files that end with .exe, all the way through. So that's kind of like the most simplest, entry level forensic job, right? Like trying to find files. The other cool thing about artifacts is that the whole point of an artifact is to automate this stuff, right? So if I wanted to know all the executables in a user's home directory, I mean, that's fine. But usually, again, let's think about higher level questions. Why do I care about that? Why do I want to know about it? Well, because maybe some of them might be suspicious. Well, then, let's answer that question. Let's answer the higher level question. What, maybe an executable has to, we need to collect hashes. We need to compare them to whatever, right? So we can think about automating this stuff, right? The idea is to try and remove all the manual stuff from the analysis. And this is an example of that I want to show you is SQL eCMD, which is a tool, actually an open source project. SQL eCMD is an open source project to document location of SQLite files, because SQLite files are used, everywhere, right? Browsers, but also a lot of other tools use it. And this is a very cool project, just trying to figure out where these files normally reside and how to get them. So we can take that project, and we can essentially, we can use a script to convert that into a query so that we can essentially do the same thing in VQL. So let's do that. So we're going to choose the SQL eCMD artifact, and you can see it's actually going to be it's a really big artifact, because it's the whole repository of all the different. It builds these queries automatically from those other things. But you can see that that's the SQL eCMD project, is that they've actually written a whole bunch of SQLite queries to pull the interesting information out of the SQLite files, not just get the files, but they're actually also querying each file and pulling out, tables that are useful. In the case of like browser cookies, they convert like timestamps and stuff. So it's actually a really cool project. It's very helpful, and we can just take that whole thing and just and then just convert it to VQL and just write it in VQL. So this is the example. We're going to launch it, and because of the way that it works, it basically just goes through and just finds SQLite files everywhere, and I mean, as you've seen, like you don't really need to know VQL to use this stuff, right? I mean, I didn't need to write anything. I could use someone else's. This is a pretty sophisticated artifact with a lot of good information, but I could just use it, right? I just grab it, it's built in. I can use it or get it from the exchange. So you don't have to really be very, very familiar with VQL to use Velociraptor. It helps, but you don't have to. And you can see that we've already got 9 rows. It's still running, but we can already start to see what we've got, right? So we returned, so this first one is it basically tries to find, you can see that we have several sources in these result sets. The top one is basically trying to find all the different SQLite files, but then it parses each one and pulls the important information out. So these are the Chromium cookies and the downloads and fav icons and so on, right? History, like these sort of things, right? So these are all like forensically cool things, browser shortcuts. This is what we would expect, basically. Search history and all these kind of stuff. And it's done automatically as part of Velociraptor and the SQL eCMD project. So again, open source tools working together. That's really great. All right, so this is the other thing I wanted to show you here is when we look at the query log, then we will see that generally with SQLite files, they are sometimes locked because the thing is using them, right? And Velociraptor is smart enough to figure out that if they're locked, then it can actually extract the SQLite file and copy it, and then parse the copy. So then to avoid this locking thing. So just showing you here that it's saying, hey, this file is locked. So I'm just going to copy it aside, then I'm going to parse it. So it's a little bit more resilient than, you know, just writing a Python script, because it knows how to get around these issues. You know, we've got all the rows that are returned and so on, right? So that's pretty neat. Yeah, so we've got all these results. That's really cool. So now we're going to look at how to inspect the data with the table widget. So the thing about, here's the results, right? And the thing about it is that a lot of these tables, they're just pretty wide. It's a pretty, there's a lot of columns. Let's see, let's say, I don't know, history. And sometimes it's kind of a bit squeezed. So you can actually use this column selector here to turn columns, you know, on and off. So to make it a little bit more, you know, easier to see. So you can, you know, a lot of the time the columns are not very interesting. You can turn that off and make, so I'll clean up the table a bit. And when you do that, then you can click this. So the next one along is the row response JSON. That shows you the raw data in JSON, the actual raw data, which we're going to use that a little bit later. Well, if you're going to write queries, you're going to use it. I'm not sure if we're using it, but that's a really important view to be able to see exactly what the data is looking like. So it's not just the GUI. The next thing along, so if you update the table or filter it or whatever, then you can download the data in JSON and in CSV. So JSON on one side or CSV. So for example, like in this case, you know, if I turned off, you know, all these columns, then I downloaded, you know, either the CSV or the JSON, then it will, you know, not output those other columns that, so it cleans up the data a bit. And then finally, the last one along here is the filter table transformation. And for example, like, let me just go back and show all the, oh, is that all? Oops, is that all? Show all the columns. So in this case, for example, like, let's say that, you know, we have URLs, you know, like DFIRWS, right? So I can create a table transform where I can say filter the URL and then give it like a regular expression, DFIRWS, and then, you know, and then save it. And it basically just like filters, it's just like what you would expect, right? It just filters that table to just show you those columns. But the point is that once you filter it in this way, then when you download the CSV, it's the filtered CSV that you're downloading, so you can like reduce your data a little bit. And that is not the best way to do post-processing, but it's a quick way to do it. We do have another question. Would it be possible to have an image of a hard drive connected as a client? So that is a very good question. So we don't really use hard drives in DFIR because it's just not practical, right? Like an image of a hard drive. Because I mean, this is kind of like very old school. So it's not a huge priority, but in recent versions, it is possible to do what we call dead disk analysis. It's still experimental, but it is possible, and there is a blog post about it. I think it came out in 064, so it's very recent, dead disk forensics. So you can read that and follow that, but it basically works by emulating a client. So it's like running like a virtual client on top of the disk. So then you run the same artifacts or collect the same artifacts from that virtual client. Because the whole point of this, so I mean, at the end of the day, Velociraptor is just a VQL engine, right? So we're just running, we have all the parsers, so we can do it all. But what we want to do is have so we don't really want to change the artifacts, but we want to run the same VQL in different contexts. So we want to say, hey, you know, this VQL query is running on the live client, and the same query has to run on the disk, on the dead disk image without change, right? Because we don't want to have like different versions of the query. This one works on disk, this one works on live, right? We want to kind of emulate it. So that's kind of, this is the work. You read that and it will explain like how we do that. But
perfect. Thank you. So it would be interesting for us, because we are doing often forensics for customers where we don't have direct access to the PC, so we can't install an executable or something like that. And with that, we could just gather the images from the customer and could then, when we have 50 or hundreds of different PCs with images, we can just run one query and hit all the PCs at once. So that would be...
it's not as easy as that. What we normally do for these cases is we use something called the offline collector. And I'm not sure if we're covering it in this workshop, but the offline collector, if you look at triage and acquisition here, it basically, what we can do is we can create a collector that is pre-programmed to collect all the artifacts that we want. And then it basically gives you like an executable, right? Which already knows what it's doing. And then you just run that executable and it basically makes a zip file and it packages it all up. And you can actually even get it to, I'll show you real quick. You basically go over here. It's really super easy, right? You go over to server artifacts and you click that little paper plane thing. And then like, let's say we want to do prefetch, but I mean, you know, you'd normally collect a bunch of stuff, you know, in this context, right? But like, let's say you want to do like some prefetch timelining and, you know, whatever. And then you can configure it exactly the same as we did so far, right? So far, it's exactly the same. You configure it, you can filter, whatever, right? But usually with these things, we collect a lot of data. So we don't really do that. And then we basically just, you just kind of like, you know, when you launch it. So what this does is it will create the binary. So it actually goes off to GitHub right now to get the Windows binaries. And it's probably my internet is a bit slow, but it will create the binary, it will pre-create it. And it downloads, it only does that download once the first time, but it's going to basically grab all the binaries and create a package. And then we run it. And it just builds, it just does what we told it and create like a zip file. And then you can tell them, or, you know, can you just forward me the zip file? But it's not a full disk image, right? Because you can't really do a disk image in a DFIR case because, you know, it's too big, right? So it will...
we can then also run queries on, so we can import that gathered zip file into Velociraptor again?
Exactly. Cool. So you can take that and then import it back into the GUI. And then you can use notebooks and things. So you can do all that stuff, but it's like, it's more of a triage collection like EVTX. Like you can get all the EVTX, the MFTs, like all these things, right? It can be quite big, right? I'll show you real quick here, it's done. So here it created the collector, right? And we just download it. And let me just start another one of those. You have to run it, obviously, as administrator. But the idea is that, like, a lot of the time, you know, because we don't, when a lot of the time we have like someone on the other team helping us, and they're not really forensic people. So we don't really want to tell them, oh, you know, run this tool and type this huge command line, and it's not going to work. This thing never works, right? So the idea is to try and make it like super simple for them. So this is really just, it's just Velociraptor, right? Like there's no difference, but it's pre-configured. So it's the configuration file is actually written in the binary, right? To do, to collect what we told it, right? So all they have to do is just run it. That's it, right? Exactly like this. And you'll see it will start off, in this case, I just did a prefetch, so it's quick, right? But it's just going to do the prefetch. So this is what it's collecting, right? And then it makes the zip file. And that's it. So we tell it, okay, you know, this is the collection, send it to us, whatever, right? And this will be like gigabytes because you'll have MFT and EVTX and all this. But that's called offline collection, we say. So we don't really install anything.
Perfect. So we have something like that, but just written it on our own. So This is really
this
awesome.
is fully
So I would-
Velociraptor, so you've got access to everything like USN, prefetch, all the parsers, everything, right?
Yeah,
So
right.
it's a really powerful thing. So I mean, a lot of the time people use it just for collecting files, like the Cape file targets, which has like all the file collections, bulk data. But you can actually also parse it on the endpoint directly, you know. Yeah, yeah.
Perfect.
So
Yeah.
this is I don't know if we cover it here, but it's a very common use case for Velociraptor.
Awesome.
Good
Thank
question.
you.
Cool. This is a great discussion, actually. All right. So we talked about filtering and sorting the tables and exporting it. So we did that. Querying the registry. So querying the registry, we use something like we use something called an accessor to access data. I mentioned it a couple of times, but an accessor is just a way of making something look like a file system. And the reason that we use those is so that we can use wildcards to search something that looks like a file system. So you can imagine that, you know, we've talked about the file finder before, and then the next thing that people want to know is like, how do I search the registry? So if we make the registry look like a file system, then we can use the same wildcards and we can search those things, right? So so we can do the same thing. You would have noticed it here in the there was a registry part as well, and it's exactly the same thing as you'll just see all your routes, you know, and you can just like do that. But it's the same thing. You can use the file finder. This is a bit misleading. You can use the Windows file finder to search the registry as well. All you have to do is change it to a registry, right? So you'll see here there's an accessor, and if you change that to registry, then you can put your globe as a registry key, right? And you can still use stars and all this stuff, right? So it's exactly the same thing. All right. So okay, so the next example that I have here is actually pretty cool. It's disabling the event logs, and this is something that's actually pretty cool. And a lot of people get surprised with this, so I like to add it in. So I don't have to tell you guys that the event logs are really important for DFIR, right? Like there are, you know, there's a lot of information in the event logs, and sometimes it's the only piece of information that there is for detection. And a lot of EDRs and detection solutions are just about forwarding event logs, right? So a lot of people don't know that you can just disable the event logs. It's really easy. And let me show you in this section. So what we're going to do in this example is we're going to disable the bits client event log. So I'm not going to go too much into bits, but bits is like a it's in the MITRE attack framework. So attackers do it all the time. Basically, it's just a nice way of downloading payloads because it's a signed executable and it runs all the time, and it's a service, and it can do it. You know, there's a lot of reasons why people want to use bits to download their malicious payloads. But so attackers use it all the time, and there is actually a log that tells you when bits was running, right, and where it downloaded from and so forth. So it's really important to have that log, because then you can see, oh, you know, there was an attack. But it turns out, so you can actually go and find the log. We're going to do that now. So we're going to start the event viewer. There it is. So we'll open it. And all right, here's the event viewer. So we'll open up actually this one, application and service logs. And yeah, it's a little bit slow. It's going to come in a minute. Okay, but let me just quickly show you while this event log is loading. You can see that there is a bits client operational log. So it's just like one of the log files that has bits related information in it. And it's really important information because it tells you, oh, I downloaded this from this URL. And if you see like, you know, malware URL in there, you can know that, hey, this is a problem, right? Oh, here it is. Okay, so it's going to be Microsoft, Windows, and then it'll be like bits clients. Where is it? Bits client. We open that, operational. There we go. Let me just make it a bit bigger. And if you look here, and we can see that it's downloaded from all kinds of stuff. So this is like the Edge release and, you know, whatever. This is just a clean machine, so it's not owned. It will be pretty normal, but you can see that the URL is there. So that's really cool. And, you know, a lot of people rely on that for forensics. But it turns out that if I was an attacker and I'd be like, hey, I want to use bits, but I don't want to leave any traces. So I'm going to disable this log. Well, you might think, oh, it's really complicated disabling the log. It's not. You just right click on it and you click disable log, done, right? And that actually disables the log. So now if you're going to collect these event logs, then you won't see any of the bits activity. So, so that's kind of disappointing, I guess. This is very easy to do that. So the question is, did the attacker do that? How do we detect whether they disabled the logs, right? And can we use that as a detection, as a signal to say, hey, you know, something is, you know, really fishy on this machine, right? So this is how you disable it. You can try it, clear the log, and I think there was a command here that you can try. Let me just do the exercise. So just let's clear the log so we can see a little bit better. So we'll clear it. Let's enable it again. Enable the log. And now what we're going to do is just run this command bits admin transfer, and we're just going to download google.com, and we're going to store it as like a PS file. This is a typical. I mean, it's not malicious, obviously, but it's a typical behavior. It just runs bits and downloads, you know, maybe a PowerShell file, which would be the malware. So if we go to the event log and push F5, then we'll see that log, right? So here's the log. Oops, sorry, don't click that URL. So you can see the log that, you know, it happened, right? So this is really important. Now let's clear it again. Clear the log. Right, and now we're going to disable it, disable the log, right? And we do the same thing, and we won't have, you know, we're not going to have any logs, right? So now that we do it, go back to our F5, doesn't matter, right? It's disabled, right? So we're not going to see that log in there. So you can see that's actually kind of like pretty bad, right? Anyway, how do we determine whether the machine had that happen, right? So it turns out there is a blog post over here that you can read about, but it turns out that by disabling the log, when I click that thing in the UI, it changed some keys, and there was some kind of registry keys that changed. So that's great, right? Like someone had gone through, done the research, figured out what changed, and well, that was me, but I've written a VQL artifact to get that information, Windows event logs modifications, right? So let's have a look at that artifact and see what exactly it is, right? So so it basically talks about disabling logs and figuring out, you know, what it is, and you can see that it has some keys in the registry where this basically indicates whether the log is enabled or disabled. And it turns out that there are actually two different places where you can disable a log, and it basically queries those keys and figures out whether they're set or not. So I'm not going to go too much into the VQL of it, but the long and the short of it is that someone had figured out that some places in the registry is really important for something, written a VQL query, and I'm just going to go ahead and use it. So let's have a look and see. this artifact. So I'm going to collect this, right? And look at the parameters, and the parameters allow me to select which provider I'm going to look at. So I'm just, for the moment, I'm just going to select all of them and then click a launch. Right, and essentially that artifact goes and checks the registry and writes and returns the query. And I'm looking at the results, and I can see these are the different channels, which are the different, essentially they're the log files, the name of the log file here, bits client operational. And then here, this is the GUI of the publisher of that log. And this one tells me whether it's enabled and disabled. And on a Windows system, a lot of logs will be disabled by default, and some will be enabled. See, some will be enabled by default, and some will be disabled by default. So you can see that. And then the other thing it tells me here is the modification time. If an attacker changed that key, then I will know that the modification time will help to build a timeline of what happens, right? So we know when it happened. Okay, so let's repeat this thing. And this time, when you repeat a collection, you don't have to select it from scratch. You can just go and copy it. So that copies the whole thing. And then if you switch to the parameters, then you can tweak the parameters a bit, right? So in this case, I'm going to search for, I'm just going to filter for the bits client because I don't care about all the other ones. So I've got normally like 1,300 rows, and I'm going to have like 3 rows. So it's a bit easier to see, right? And so I can see, it's disabled now because I disabled it, right? So, yeah, so the provider is enabled, but the channel is disabled. So there's 2 places where you can disable it. So this is the check, right? So now I can do a hunt across my 10,000 machines and say, hey, which ones have this disabled? And then it usually sticks out like a sore thumb that like, hey, these machines have it disabled, but it's usually enabled on all my other boxes. So yeah, so this is what we did. We searched for that, we filtered. So this is really important because what I've just done is I've become more targeted. And this is actually, I just want to say a couple of words about being more targeted. Traditionally in DFIR, the mindset is we're going to go and collect as much data as we can, just in case, and that sort of makes sense when you have like 1 or 2 machines. But when you have 10,000, 20,000, 50,000 machines, you just can't collect everything, right? You have to be more targeted. And also, it just takes too long to collect so much data and handle this data and post-process and all that. And it's also not needed. If you have a tool like Velociraptor, you can always go back and ask the question, right? You can ask, you can pivot based on the information that you get, and then go immediately and get that information all the time. So the mindset is very different from your traditional, shotgun approach, right? And it's really important to be more targeted and just get the information that we want. We've just gone from 1,300 rows to 3. So we are much more targeted and we are much more effective. Yes, we don't have all the data, but that's okay. That client is still connected, still online. In half an hour, when I discover another event log, I can just do the same thing and get that. I can go back to the source and get that information. So, so I can always, iterate through quickly and be more targeted. So there's always a bit of a balance of collecting more or being more targeted. All right, yeah. So the point is that the endpoint is really the ultimate source of truth, rather than if we need more data, we just go back and get it all the time, right? So in this case, you can see that that we can enable, disable, we can check the endpoint at all times. All right, so what we're going to do now is we're going to just have another few minutes of break, and then we're going to talk about notebooks, which is the next really cool thing. And so I think let's do another 5-minute break and then come back so we can stretch our legs or whatever, right? All right, welcome back. All right, so just before, we've seen how we went down in a more targeted way from collecting a lot of data, and then to the alternative of that was to filter on the endpoint so we can send back less data. So in this case, in this example, we've sent 1,300 rows when we collected all the bits providers, and then we filtered and we're more targeted in our queries and sent back 3 rows instead. So that's not such a big deal, you know, in this case, because there's not really a lot of data anyway. But you can imagine that if we had, you know, if we have a lot more rows or a lot more data that we're sending back, then being targeted is important. But what if we actually did collect all the 1,300 rows? What if we wanted to actually do post-processing and filter that on the server? So we can actually do that. And I just wanted to introduce you to the notebook right now. So here's the notebook. You can click on it in a notebook tab. And if you've ever used Jupyter Notebook or something similar, or Code Lab or something like that, then you'll be familiar with the concept of a notebook, which is just like if you like, a Google Docs, shared collaboration type environment. But in Velociraptor, the notebook is built around VQL. So we can actually write freeform VQL and look at results. And it's usually in Velociraptor, the notebooks are really powerful and they're used for post-processing a lot of the data and just looking at it in a more intelligent way. So let me introduce you to the notebook. When you click on the notebook tab, Velociraptor will create a new notebook, a default notebook. And usually the default notebook is just showing the first 50 rows of the results. And if we have, in this case, we have several different results. So it shows two different cells. These are called cells. This square is called a cell. And by default, you can't see those borders because it's kind of like designed to be more like a free-flowing document kind of. But if you click on it, then it comes into focus and you can see it. And inside of this cell, we have VQL, right? So if we click on the edit button, then we can edit the contents of the cell. And you can see that by default, the notebook creates a cell that just allows us to look at the data. And this is a VQL query that we can use to look at the data. The source query just reads the files from the server, right? So it's really just looking at the collected data. It's not collecting it again. It's just looking at the already collected data, just reading it back out. But we can actually extend this, and over here, now we can write VQL. So we have in the notebook, we have command suggestions. So it's easy to type, right? It's very quick. So we can go where. In this case, we're only interested in the bits client, right? So you see there's a column here called channel name. So I can just paste that, channel name. And Velociraptor has a couple of operators. It doesn't have as many operators as SQL, but this operator is the regular expression operator. It's sort of like a Perl, like in Perl, right? It's kind of like equal tilde, regular expression. And we use regular expressions a lot in VQL, right? It's used extensively. So this kind of thing is very common. So in this case, what we're going to do is we're going to just look at all of the results where the channel name matches like it looks like bits, right? Bits. So if we click the save, it will rerun this query, and we're going to get those 2 rows that we had. So this is a way of filtering on the server. We've seen before how we can do it. So here we've seen how we can actually do it with the table transform. The table transform is kind of like the GUI way of doing it. It's less powerful because it's just a very simple match. In this case, it would be the same thing. But with the notebook, we can write very complex VQL to post-process that data. So it's actually a much more powerful way to do it. Right, so these are notebooks. And I'm not sure how much we go into notebooks in this session, but it is like one of the best features of post-processing. So you pretty quickly want to be familiar yourself with notebooks. All right, so let's have a look at hunting at scale. And hunting is really the best thing that is really the most important thing that we can do with Velociraptor. So far, we've collected this data from one endpoint, right? So we can do that with one endpoint, but that's not, I've mentioned it before that we also want to run the same thing on multiple endpoints, right? So that is called hunting. So hunting just means that we're going to collect the same artifact from lots of endpoints at the same time. And there's really two types of hunting when we're doing hunting. One type is that we want to be very targeted, and that type of hunt is usually very targeted, and we are returning a yes/no answer in this type of hunt. And an example is to say, who has the Beats client log disabled, right? Which machine has it disabled? So if the machine is disabled, if it's supposed to be enabled and one machine is disabled, then it's already very targeted and it gives us a very strong indication that something's wrong with this machine. So it's very much targeted and aimed at yes/no answer in this type of hunt, right? So this advice is about designing or thinking about how to hunt, in reality. The other way of doing it is to collect more of a baseline to understand what is happening in the environment. And in that case, you're just collecting a lot of data and you're trying to try and find things that stick out that are not the same as everywhere else. And that's how you get that information, right? So there are two different approaches to identifying, anomalies. And they're both valid and they both work, right? But you just have to decide what is the goal of this hunt. And because in Velociraptor, to do a hunt, it only takes you a minute. So you can do both. You can do baselining when you need to, or you can do very targeted hunts when you need it as well. So it really just depends on what you want to do. So let's have a look at baselining event logs. So what we're going to do is we're going to start up more clients, because at the moment, hunting on one client is kind of boring, right? It's like, this is just one client. So what we want to do is we want to hunt with lots of clients. So we want to start up lots of clients. So this is what we're going to do is we're going to use a little trick in Velociraptor, because we don't have 1,000 machines built up, right? So we're going to get Velociraptor to just spin up. We won't do 1,000 because it's probably too many, but maybe let's say, 50 or 100 clients. And then we can use that to show you what it feels like to do a real hunt in a real environment. So what I'm going to do first of all is just, if you recall, I mentioned that when you run the Velociraptor GUI, it creates the data store in the temp folder, right? So usually, so we're just going to go there. And this is basically where Velociraptor stores all its files, because, with this mode, just in the temp folder right now. But what we're going to do is we're going to get Velociraptor to run, let's say 100 clients, full clients, right? So, okay, so I'm going to have to, actually, I'm going to have to go. Users, test, downloads. Oops, not that one. So I'm going to run the same commands. And what does this command do? So it's going to run, I'll go back to here. So we're running Velociraptor with the client config. So it just looks like a client, but instead of running one client, we run something called the pool client. A pool client is just like, it's running lots of clients in different threads, on the same process, but they all basically they're all completely different to each other, right? So they don't see each other. They're separate. But so they pretend to be their own clients. And this is a tool that we use for load testing usually. So we can do a lot of load on the server. But it basically starts up 100 clients. But it gives us in this workshop, it's going to be more of an exercise to see like how it feels like to have a real network, you know, with Velociraptor. So once it runs this thing, then when we search for when we go show all the clients, then you should see 100 separate clients show up right now. So remember there was one before, now there's 100. So so now we've got something to play with, kind of thing, right? So so what we're going to do is we're going to switch on our bits clients, enable it. So that's the default position, right? So that this is what it normally does. And what we're going to do now is we're going to create a hunt where we're going to check the bits clients. We're going to check which bits, which machines have we're going to check all of the log positions. So are they enabled or disabled, right? So the same thing that we did before, but what we're going to do now is we're going to do it as a hunt. So we're going to do it on all 100 machines at once. And we only have 100 here because we don't want to have too much time, but it could be thousands. So we're just going to go to this thing here, the hunt manager. And the hunt manager is how we create hunts. We're going to click the plus so it adds a new hunt. We can give the hunt a description, right? We're going to say, you know, look for disabled loads, for example. And hunts they just don't expire, right? So the hunt's always present, because when a client shows up, then we want to check for, you know, for disabled log. So it's going to go and run it's going to run that artifact, that query on this machine. So the hunts don't really stop, they just expire. So we start now, and by default it's going to be available for the next week. And if a new client appears after a week, within the next week, then it will do that as well. So it's kind of like a dynamic thing. And over here, it's telling us how many clients are estimated. So we've got 101 clients, so it knows that. We can also, in real life, you're gonna have clients that sort of like, you know, just die off. So to get an idea of how many clients, you can look at the day active, you know, 1 day active, 1 week active, and so on. We can match by labels. This is where I showed you the labels before. You can target hunts. So you can say only the developer machines we're going to run this, or only the sales machines or whatever, right? So you can use labels or operating systems to target it. But we're just going to keep it simple right now. We're just going to look for disabled logs, all of these things, right? Now, remember that it's the same thing. We're going to pick our artifact that we did before. So it's the same Windows event logs modifications. So it's just going to, the same thing is going to look at the registry keys and going to tell us which ones are enabled, which ones are disabled. And what we're going to do is, because we're doing a baseline, we're just going to collect all of the providers here. So we're just going to leave that as it is and kick it off, right? So when we start the hunt, we have to remember that you're about to do this like on potentially 10,000 machines. So have a bit of a think. Am I happy to do this? It starts off in the paused position, right? And you have to click run this hunt, and off it goes, right? So you have to think about, you know, doing that. And then you'll see that immediately it will schedule it on all the machines. That this could be like thousands pretty quick. And this number on the top is the scheduled ones, and then each one does its thing, and then it finished, right? So it basically just kind of like schedules them and finishes them, you know, within a few seconds later, right? So now we can see all the clients have finished collecting this data. We can see the clients tab, all the clients, because they're all the same, they're on the same machine. So they're going to give us the same answer, right, each time. But, you know, usually they'll have some variation there because they're all different machines. And each of those is a separate collection. You can actually, from this UI, you can look at each individual results if you wanted to. But we're gonna see later how to do post-processing here. So in this case, what I've done, because right now all these clients have the event log enabled, right? Because I've just enabled it and run the hunt. But what I'm going to do now is I'm going to just give you an idea of like how it looks like when one or two machines have it disabled. But because I don't want to, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to shut down this pool client right now, and I'm going to enable, disable this machine, disable, right? So now the log is disabled. And what I'm going to do now is I'm going to start off another, let's say, 2 machines. So we're going to start off 102 pool clients. So before it was 100, now it's 102. So it will go off and it will start the previous 100 again, and it will create another 2, right? New ones. And those new ones are going to receive the hunts because they just showed up, like they're just new ones, because the hunt is still active, right? So the hunt is already active and it will immediately go up from 101 to 103, right? And it will get, so these 2 ones will have the different results, right? Because they're now disabled. So they ran the query on at a slightly different time. But in reality, they might be completely different clients, right? And so now we're going to see how it feels like to do this kind of baselining analysis, right? So here's what it looks like. So we have the pool client, it runs off. We have a whole bunch of clients here. They all collected some stuff. We created a hunt. We ran the hunt, event log modifications, collected the results for 100 machines. Now we're going to talk about stacking. So stacking is a common technique that is used for finding anomalous behavior. So in this case, there was 100 machines that had the event log enabled, the bits client event log enabled, and then there was 2 machines that had it disabled. So when we compared them to each other, it should be easy to see which ones stick out. They're not normal, right? Those clients are not normal. So let's have a look how that looks like. So again, we have the notebook, and this is where we normally do the post-processing inside the notebook, right? So here's the notebook, and the same thing that happens before, but now we're looking at a hunt, right? So now we're actually looking at results from all the clients together, right? So when we go over here and we can modify this query. Now remember, before we actually just went where, this is what we did before, right? Channel name matches bits, right? This is what we did before. But instead of just doing it on one client now, we're doing it across the hunt. So you'll see that it has a whole bunch of client ID, flow ID. So these are different clients, right? And different host names, right? So they're all different. And so we're getting 2, remember we got 2 rows per host, but now we're getting 2 rows per this host, 2 rows per this host, 2 rows per this host. So each, and it goes on, right? So what we really want to know is which ones are different, which hosts are different than before. So this is called stacking. What we're going to do is we're going to group them. We're going to create a group, and we're going to say, instead of the where, right, we're going to do a group by, which is a query, and we're going to group by the channel name, and right, whether it's enabled. So together, right? So basically, what it will do is it will go through for each row, and it will say, okay, this is the bits client analytic, it's enabled, great. This is bits client operate. Now, if I get bits, so it will put it into one group, and then if I get bits client analytic is disabled, or the opposite, then it will go into another group. So it just basically groups them according to identical values of, this pair, right, together, right? So now, and I can also count as count. So this will count how many are in each group, right? So I can run this. Let's just do that quickly. And I will show you that. it's going to take a little while. It's going to go through and stack those, right? And remember, because Velociraptor doesn't really have a database, it actually goes through and looks at all the rows. It's basically doing a row scan. So you can see that for most of these logs, all the machines are the same, right? Because there's no difference, right? So the AMSI debug enabled 0, 103 machines have the same value for both things, right? So it's not changed. But as we go through, there might be some, some changes, right? So it's a little inconvenient to see. So what we're going to do is we're going to order it as well. So we're going to go down here, order by count, and this descending, right? So actually, no, not descending. We really want order by count. So do that again, and this time it's going to order it by the count. So the ones that have the lowest count will be at the top, and the ones that have the highest count will be down the bottom, right? So so this is exactly what we want, right? So what this is telling me here is that there are two instances where bits client operational had 0 enabled, so it's disabled, right? But there are 101 instances where bits client operational had enabled 1. So this means that these two machines, they are like unusual, they stick out, right? So this is called stacking. I don't know what the real value, what it's supposed to be, right? Is it supposed to be enabled or disabled? Don't know. But I can tell just from that these two machines are different from the other ones. So therefore, I need to look into them and see why are they disabled and all the other ones are enabled. That's a suspicious thing. So this is called stacking, and it's an example of doing hunts to create a baseline and then looking at the odd ones out to try and identify what's weird about them. It's a valid technique.
So
yeah, go ahead.
One question. How can we now easily see which machines those are? So in that table, I don't see which machines.
Exactly, because we're doing a group, right? So what we're doing in groups is we're taking all the rows and we're just throwing them into a group. So we do have a client ID 1, which is like a random number of those rows, right? But it actually represents, because it's a group, right? That one row represents 2 separate like original rows, right? So that is one client, but we want to know the other ones. So what we need to do now is we want to say, hey, this is odd, so that's great. So let's do this. Let's do that. So it's an excellent question, right? So what we're going to do now is we know that this condition is odd, and then we can just filter it where, right? Channel name.
Okay. So we just have to do another check.
Another query, yeah. Feeds.
Yeah.
And then we can say and not enabled, right? So because enabled was like 0, right? So so that's the one we want, right? Where it's 0, right? And yeah, and then we can actually like
yeah, got it. Okay, thanks.
So that would just give us those ones. But yeah, oh, it's doing that group by again because I've got it in the same cell, but that's okay. It's not going to take too long. Oh yeah, so that's not exactly right because it's giving me the analytic one and I wanted the operational one. So it's a regex, so I can go dots, and I put. You can also comment because it's like SQL. You can comment it a bit. It'll be a bit faster. So yeah, so it is actually sweeping across because it's not really indexed. It's not a database, but it really does sweep across the data. That's not too bad, but it's okay, right? So it gives us these are the two machines that had it set to 0, right? So it's 2 client IDs. So it's yeah, it's not too bad. Usually we don't do it very frequently, so it doesn't matter too much. Some people prefer to feed the data to Elastic and then do like searches in Elastic and these kind of things. And that helps when you're doing a lot of searches. But like if I just did this, you know, if it's going to take me like a minute instead of a second, I don't care, right? I'm only doing it once. It's not a big deal. And it's going to be faster anyway than pushing it to Elastic, parsing it, and then querying it in the end anyway. So yeah, I usually do it like that. All right, so let's move on to the next topic, which is the NTFS. And you guys are all forensic experts, so you know all about NTFS. So I'm not going to spend too much time with NTFS, but I just wanted to show you some of the capabilities around NTFS analysis and how we can use that in DFIR. So NTFS, you know, the file system in Windows. We're going to skip that stuff, right? It's obvious. The cool thing about NTFS is it has an MFT, master file table. So there's a big table. I'm just going to cover it in a very few words. You guys know it. MFT is just a big table of what's called MFT entries. Each MFT entry contains information about one file, and they're just kind of like in a big table. So they all have the same size. We basically have inside each file, we have something called streams. So we have something like standard information or attributes, standard information, file name, data, different attributes. They're doing different things. Yeah, it can be resident and non-resident. And yeah, these are all details. Here's a quick picture, what it looks like. So this is what a disk would look like. Over here, we have the volume boot record over here, and it starts off, there's an MFT, there's like MFT records, entries all over. Each one corresponds to a file. Inside of here, there is something called the run list, which tells you where the file content might live on the disk. So the content lives somewhere else. And then here, we just have like a list of where, right? So that's basically it. So how do we use NTFS or knowledge about NTFS to find suspicious files, to understand what could happen in DFIR? So usually in DFIR, we normally are interested in finding files, right? As we mentioned that before, file names, path, file types, contents, things like that. So we already saw the glob. Remember, glob was the way that we search with wildcards. We've seen that with the file finder. But on Windows specifically, we actually can search much faster and much more efficiently by looking at the MFT. And that gives us the ability to look, so because the MFT represents every file on the disk, then by parsing it and just reading all the file names from the MFT, then we don't really need to recurse directories and call a lot of API calls. We just quickly parse through the MFT. So it's much faster to parse an MFT for all executables on the disk, for example, than to walk all the directories. And also, it gives us the ability to see things that perhaps are unallocated or deleted or whatever, right? So we can see MFT slack, like entries that have been deleted but are still there, and we can look at them, but are not actually used. So we can't access them using the API directly. So the main Velociraptor plugin that does this is this one called Parse MFT. And then we can use something called Yara, which is like a searching engine to look for patterns in the MFT. And that's also another way that we can use to find suspicious files. So let's talk about that. This is one of the most popular plugins, or most powerful plugins, I guess you can say. So let's talk about the first one, which is Windows Forensics File Name Search. And this particular artifact does something very clever, right? So basically, it's at the same time very clever as at the same time very dumb. It does both things. It's clever and dumb at the same time. So what it does is it says, well, here's the MFT, right? It's just a big list, and somewhere inside of each entry is the file names. So let's say that we are looking for file names, a particular name, like a particular payload for phishing or executables or whatever. So what would be the dumb thing to do? Well, we're just going to look for a pattern, right? Like if it's going to have like, you know, the file is called foobar.exe or whatever, then, you know, if it's anywhere on this disk, and that this is a very common DFIR question, which machine out of my 10,000 machines had foobar.exe on it, right? This is a very common question. Because this represents maybe the attackers laterally moved to that machine, right? And they use that is the name of their payload, and I want to know which one got infected, right? So, so what's the dumb thing to do? We're just going to look for the pattern inside the MFT, and somewhere it's going. If there's a hit somewhere, if the name is reasonably unique, and I'm making a hit on the MFT, then I know that the file could have been there somewhere and I need to look more deeply into it. But if I don't get any hit on that MFT, then I know that there's no chance that, at least there's no evidence that this file was there. I mean, it could have been deleted or whatever, but that's the point, right? We can't get any more information than we could have otherwise. So it's a very fast way of scanning through the MFT. So that's the first, so it's clever and dumb all at the same time. It's pretty cool. So let's do that. Let's do an exercise around that. So the second example is actually parsing the MFT. So it's actually like going through, parsing each one, and then comparing the file names and so on. So they are very different. This one is dumb because it just looks at patterns, right? So sometimes you make a hit on an MFT entry, and it happens to be like maybe in an I30 Slack. And it's not really a file name, it's actually the directory that contained that file. And there's no evidence of the file, but it's still there somehow. So sometimes you're making like, this one is really good for finding any trace of this particular file name on the disk, right? So it can sometimes find it when the other one can't, right? And then this one actually parses every entry in the MFT, and then it looks at the file names, right? So it's easy to use, and we can filter by all these kind of things. So then we have an exercise here. And for this exercise, we're going to generate some test data. So let me just open that. All right, yeah. So if you click like that link, sorry, then you'll see that there is a small PowerShell script. And you can use that to just generate the data. So let me just stop this because I don't think we use that anymore. PowerShell. Yep. Okay, and just paste that into the PowerShell. And what it's going to do is it's going to download a couple of tools, psexec, procdump, etc. It's going to try and what this exercise does is it tries to replicate what an attacker actually does on the machine, right? Like, so it downloads a bunch of tools, it puts them in a weird place like perflogs, it's kind of like heart of the way, and then it adds some ADS to it, alternate data streams. So we're trying to emulate what does it look like when when an attacker does these things. And then it deletes some stuff, and yeah, so that prepares the there was a small bug here, I think. We started calc, and you have to change these things to do, instead of Win32 calc, it has to just be calc. Yeah, so that's going to do a proc dump of the tool, and then it's going to kill the process. So that's the next one. So what this emulates is an attacker using proc dump to extract. In this case, we're using calc.exe as just the example, but an attacker will usually extract LSAS that way, something like that. Okay, and then we're removing, and then it removes, then it creates a compressed archive and removes it. So we need to do that. I think there was a small bug in that thing. So you see it compresses the X field, creates an exfil file and compresses it, including the dump, memory dump of a thing, and then deletes it, deletes the original things, right? And removes everything, exfils it. So now what we are going to ask is, can we find any evidence of this behavior using MFT artifacts? So that's going to be the really cool exercise. All right, so we prepare the thing. This is what it does. So what we're going to do, the first thing, is we're going to have a look at perflogs, right? So we're going to use NTFS MFT, and we're going to, in the first example, we're going to look for anything in this perflog directory, right? So let's do that. So we're going to collect from this client. So this is one of the pool clients. I've just got to find my actual client, recent hosts. This one. Yeah, so this one's connected, right? Because I shut down my pool clients. So I just have the one that comes with it. So the same one. All right, so we're going to go to collect. I'm going to click on this thing. It's going to be the MFT artifact. So Windows NTFS MFT, right? So this one, but what it does is it basically will scan through the MFT, pull out each file, and then we can filter it and then just look at what we want to know. If I just run it without any parameters, then it's going to pull all the files on this disk. So there could be like 300, 400,000 rows in this query. It's quite a large query because it has one row per file. But what we care about is, in this exercise, we only really care about find the contents of the perflogs directory. So let me just close that. So what we want to do is we want to have a filter, okay, on the path. Now it's a regular expression, right? So so I have to do regular expression. I have to do double backslashes, right? And it's going to basically match the perflog. Actually, you know what? I'm just gonna search for perflogs because, you know, it's going to be enough. Usually, it's pretty unique. All right, so that's cool. Let's launch it. So this goes off and searches that MFT, and it's basically going to go through and look through every MFT entry and calculate the path for that entry, and then it's going to filter only on the perflogs. So we're going to look in the contents of the perflog directory. Okay, so we can actually use these kind of filtering and so on. All right, so it depends on whether we are lucky or not, because the attacker deleted a bunch of files, right? We just did this thing. So if we're lucky, we might see some unallocated files. Let's have a look. It's still doing it. So this normally takes maybe a couple of minutes because it's quite a large query, because we're going through all these rows, right? Parsing the MFT. So we're just going to talk through it while it's doing it, so save on time. And then we can actually do things like look at the USN journal to see what happened to that thing. So actually, let's do that. Well, oh, it's finished. All right, so it's finished. It took 1 minute, and we found 11 rows. And did we see any unallocated? Sometimes you don't really see unallocated. No, they're all allocated actually in use. Yeah, so we've got perflog. So these are the executables, right? So we can see all the things in the perflog directory, right? And then we can see these are the zone identifier. So this means that it was downloaded from somewhere. Procdump, these are the tools that were downloaded from wherever, and then we have various tools and so on that are, you know, in there. But this gives you an idea of how we could get anything to do with this file by parsing the MFT. So what actually was going on in that perflog directory? Let's have a look. Let's ask the USN journal. So here we're going to look for the USN journal. The USN journal is a journal that tells us what was file system changes. What are changes in the file system? So there's a USN journal, we parse it. That's kind of all we need to know, is that there is a journal that just kind of records all changes to the file system. So in this case, we can look at the USN journal, it will tell us all about all the different files. But in this case, we only care about files that are in the perflog directory. So any file that matches perflogs, we want to know about what happened there. Right? So off we go. And that's basically all we need to do. It goes off, it's going to parse out the USN journal, and it's going to only filter for those rows that have something to do with the perflog directory. So immediately, normally when you parse the USN journal, you get like a ton of other activity that's happened all over the system, and then you have to like download that and post-process it and try and figure out what's going on and restrict it only to the things that we're interested in. And this is again another example of being targeted, where we are actually only getting back the rows that have anything to do with the perflogs directory from the journal. So it's going to take a couple of minutes. Let's let that go. All right, so this is the USN journal exercise. So we're going to get the path regex. The USN journal records the file name and MFT ID. So this is important to know. When you're looking at a USN journal, normally, it only has the file name and the MFT ID. Velociraptor figures that out and uses the MFT ID to go back into the MFT file to build the full path, so that we can filter on the full path, right? And that's not always 100% reliable because things change. So it's a best effort thing, right? So let's see. Okay, so we got 10 rows here. That's good. Okay, so we've got 10 rows. Now, normally there's thousands of rows in the USN journal, but we are only caring about these perflogs. And you can see that we're trying to build the full path here, but there's a lot of unrelated stuff.
So I guess you queried the file name and not the path name.
Oh, did I do the wrong one? Sorry. Good, well spotted. Yeah, you're right. So I have to do this. Oh yeah, you're right. It's the path name. Yeah, I messed it up. All right, no worries. Do it again. I didn't take that long the first time. 41 seconds. All right, we'll probably take the same amount. So yeah. All right, cool. Yeah, so we have, oh yeah, so the path name. So it builds up the full path, right, by following the parent child, the parent MFT entry, right? But that's not always super reliable, because especially if the file was deleted, then the parent is not exactly, it's not always the same, right? Because things change. So it's could be out of date. So sometimes in the USN journal, when it builds the full path, it's best effort, right? Like sometimes it's unexpected. You don't always, it's not always correct, right? But that's the best you can do. Yeah, so, well, it's okay, a few more seconds. Yeah, so this is what it should look like, right? So we've got the USN journal. We've got the USN journal records what happens to the file. So when it was created, when it was written, when it was closed, when it was renamed, deleted, these kind of things. Oh, yeah, that's a bit better. Okay, so we've got more data now. That's good. Yeah, I was lazy. So I still have this file names, but this is the one I'm looking for, the PS exec, right? And and the proc dump. So this was created, closed, extend, named the name data. So the name was changed here. And then finally, we should see some deletions. We've got overrides. This is the exfil zip file, right? We created the exfil zip file, which we don't have it anymore, right? Because it's been deleted, but we can see it in the USN journal. We can see that it was created. There was a file created here called fake.exe. There was a test1.ps that was created, right? And so on. And it was finally removed. Data override. If we look at the end, then we should see file delete. Right? So that file was deleted. So we can tell from the timestamp, we can build a timeline, say when the file was created, what, you know, and when it was deleted. It's difficult to recover the file, but maybe we can carve for it or whatever. Right? So we can now, we get more information about what was going on in that, you know, what was going on in that attacker activity, what files they had, et cetera, et cetera. So that's kind of like how we can use analysis in NTFS to like being able to get some really good visibility into NTFS attributes. And we can do that at scale. This is the main difference, right? So for example, like if we know that this is how the threat actors work, the tools that they're pulling, they're called this timestamp.exe or whatever, that's the tool. So usually when a attacker, crew, whatever, they have a set of tools that they use, and they propagate laterally to, you know, many machines, right? So they usually move the same tools along, and they use the same tools and exfil data from different machines, right? So now, using this information, then we can get a good idea of what the tools are called, what their names are. And now we can turn it around and be very targeted. Now we can say, hey, let's look at the USN journal for exfil.zip for this name, or maybe one of the timestamper tools or whatever, right? And now we'll do a hunt across thousands of machines to see whether the USN journal on any of them contains this data at all. So now we're not looking for a perf log directory, we're looking for the tools. So if they change the directory, the staging directory, that doesn't matter, we can still catch it. And then we can get more of an idea of where the attackers laterally move to and which machines are compromised in scope. Right, so then we can go on from there and build this up, right? So you can see how we can pivot, we can get the information, learn more, pivot, move forwards, that kind of thing. Very, very powerful. And being able to do it at scale is super powerful. Yeah, so when you know what to look for, we can immediately go for, in this case, you see that they're doing, we can do post-processing where we look for deletions, files that are deleted. So we can do that. So over here, we'll do a notebook, and we are just going to look for deleted files. So where? The reason. So here, the reason. And remember, I browsed it before and showed you that some of the files were deleted. Matches, you know, deletes, whatever. And then that should just show us the deleted files. And here we see the calc.dump, which is the memory dump that was taken, right? So we can see these things are and when they happen and so on. So this is some more post-processing. What are we doing here? Grouping by full path. Yeah, so this one just shows us the unique files, because you'll see that there was lots of events related to the same file, right? Because the file was created, then it was extended, then it was deleted. So there are a lot of rows, and they're all to do with the same file. So what he's doing here is grouping by the full path, so we just have unique files that are related. So let's do that. This is the second type of group by full path. So it's this column here. So we're going to look at unique ones. Right. So there's only like, and we're only going to show the file name. Yeah. So it's a little bit, you know, so we can see all the right files. These are just like obviously not the right files, false positives. right? So we can do this post-processing and so on. So there's a whole bunch of slides here to do with time stomping and so on, but you know, time stomping is not super reliable. I don't know if it's super useful, but you can do those exercises. We're going to skip them to talk about some of the alternate data streams, which are, you know, even more interesting. And with the alternate data streams, there are a whole bunch of different data streams that are attached to different files for various purposes. For example, if it's been downloaded, these are the ADS names. You can have a zone identifier if it's been downloaded from the internet, or smart screen ones if it's been signed and you know, verified, and a number of other ones. So you can actually you can hunt for that. There's the Windows analysis evidence of download artifact that looks for zone identifiers specifically, right? And that tells us when things were downloaded. So that's, you can just collect that real quick. And what it does while it's doing that, it's looking at the user's downloads folder for a zone identifier, and then it parses the zone identifier out of it, so we can tell where, you know, things were downloaded from, right? So here is the download file path. You know, then it does other stuff like hashing and stuff like this. Checks at the M times. So this basically gives us an idea of like when files were downloaded, where did they come from, you know, these kind of things, right? So this is like where we downloaded from, you know, downloaded the binary and so on. So this is kind of useful to do as also as a hunt and see what any of our users have downloaded from the zone identifier, where did it come from, you know, these kind of things. All right, so let's do another 5-minute break, and then we'll go to the next exercise, which is using the MS build attack vector and hunting for that. So let's pause for another 5 minutes. It's a good time to pause, stretch our legs, and then we'll be in the final hour. All right, welcome back. Okay, so this is our final stretch. But I could talk about this for even like many more hours, because there's quite a lot more information. We haven't even scratched the surface. Okay, so the next really cool scenario that I wanted to cover is MS Build. MS Build is a very popular attack vector that's happening now, that a lot of threat groups are using. And you know, there's an attack number for it as well. It's using a tool called MS Build, which is part of the .NET feature build. It's like a build tool. It's like, I guess, the .NET equivalent of Make, except it's a lot more powerful than Make. It turns out that MS Build it's just a build utility, but it has the ability to build code that is inserted into a project file. So you give it like an XML project file and run it. And unlike a Make file where it uses that to just call other tools to build it, MS Build is, you can actually insert code into the build file, and MS Build will build that as like helper. It's like building a helper, I guess. And so you can abuse that by essentially putting malware in source code. The malware is in source code in the XML file. Then you call MS Build to build that, and then you have, you know, malware, right? And you can use that for all kinds of stuff, lateral movement and all those kind of, and turning on and off services and all this sort of stuff. And then the cool thing about MS Build is that it is actually, even though it's a build tool, it's still present on all the machines that have .NET, which is pretty much a lot of machines. So even most machines, I would say, have .NET, you know, installed or shipped by Windows anyway. And so it's already present on even machines that are not developer machines, like any, you know, like, you know, sales and and marketing and stuff like that, right? Like they're not really supposed to be running developer tools, but it's already on there. So it's actually been commonly abused by lots of things, and so it is quite an interesting exercise to look at. Here's a screenshot of Cobalt Strike, which is a very popular attack tool. And this is kind of like what the UI looks like, as how they're actually leveraging MS Build to run their attack, lateral movement and that sort of thing, right? So what they do is, you can see here, they run a reverse HTTP shell, and then they create a template, right, which is a .tmp, and then they call MS Build on it and use WMI remoting to run MS Build on the remote machine to build these templates. And when it builds the templates, inside of these templates, this is the XML file, then it actually ends up running the payload, and and that's how they infect their remote machine, right? So over here, we've got, when we look at how it works, then we need to be starting to think about, like, how would we detect something like that? That's kind of like the mindset I'm trying to convey here. So when we look at it, like, there's a couple of different kinds of IOCs that we can use to leverage detection. We look at this and like, how do I detect this? Well, there's a couple of opportunities. First opportunity, network IOCs. You see there's a reverse HTTPS shell. Maybe we could use a network IOC to detect that. Then we have file IOCs, because the file is being written to the remote machine, right? So it's, again, remember we talked about the NTFS, and we can find maybe evidence of those files that are written. And then we have WMI remoting. So WMI execution also leaves a lot of forensic evidence, so we can see whether WMI remote execution was occurring, right? So there's a couple of different, and then the last one is also, I guess, a file one. So there's a couple of different ways of trying to tackle this or detect on it. So we can like do brainstorming. This is kind of, and this is the power of Velociraptor, right? Where we can brainstorm these things, and then we can say, hey, let's write a query to look at this aspect or that aspect. So we can look at process chains, command line execution, disk evidence, prefetch. Maybe prefetch is helpful because we are running MS Build. Whenever we run MS Build, that's a big red flag, because, hey, non-developers typically don't run MS Build, right? It's very weird. Event logs and so on, right? So there's a whole bunch of data sources that we could use. Here we have a quick picture of what the template file looks like, just to give you an idea of what it looks. So there's a bit of an XML here, which is just the format of what an MS Build project file looks like. So it's just, just some XML stuff. But then at some point, there is actually C# code. So the C# code is part of the build file. It's embedded. And what happens, it's part of this template XML thing. And when you run MS Build on it, it compiles this and runs it, right? So it's like it's sort of like a macro, a word macro, but it's XML and C#. It's even better, right? So so this is why it's so convenient. This is a really good execution thing. And here's the template file. We can do like some decryption, and there's a key scheduler that it decrypts and so on, right? So we have a whole bunch of interesting stuff going on. Usually they decrypt, they try and obfuscate the payload a little bit, so it's not so obvious. All right, so we're going to have an exercise. We're going to do this and have a bit of a play, and then look at some of the interesting artifacts that we can use to try and detect this this payload. So it is a Cobalt Strike payload. We're trying to find compromise. Some of the interesting ones is that we could run Yara just to try and detect some signatures based on these template files. So we can run them on a globe. We can run it in zip. We can run on the NTFS file system. We can run in process memory as well. So these are some of the interesting things we can do. We can run on physical memory, and on Linux we can, and there's equivalent Linux ones as well. So here's an example of a Yara file that might be used to detect that kind of template. Now, as you can see, the templates, you know, we can pull like keyword strings out of the templates. First of all, like normally project files don't really have C# in them. It's just kind of like an abused feature, I guess. So if we're looking for like C# constructs in a template, that's very strange, right? So usually these variables are common for C#, this kind of look, but then these ones are more common like for the XML stuff, and then we've got some checks for header to check, you know. So this is how you construct like a fairly solid Yara rule for this with low false positive rate. All right, so let's do an exercise. So we have this. Yeah, so we have another quick script that helps to set up our exercise here. Thanks to Matt. So let's quickly do that. Okay. Paste it in there. Off we go. And let's have a look what it does. Make it a bit bigger. So it what it does is it kind of emulates, you know, first of all, we are enabling prefetch because prefetch is not always enabled, especially on servers. So for this workshop, we just make sure that it's enabled because we are relying on prefetch for this exercise. And then we're grabbing a couple of, this is the template, the malicious template. We're going to put it somewhere in Windows temp, and then we're going to basically run the WMI method and run the MS build on it, right? So this is, you know, how we did that. Go back again. And you can see that when we ran the WMI command and launched the template, the MS build, then this is the return from WMI, so it worked. And this now emulates what it looks like to have an MS build based compromise, right? So that's great. This is for manual setup, but we're going to do it fast. So the first thing that we're going to try and do is try and detect the payload itself, right? So in this case, for the sake of, you know, speed, we're going to just look straight out in Windows temp. But here is the Yara sig that Matt came up with in the previous slide, right? So this is a Yara sig. It's not as extensive as the one before, but it should be good enough for this exercise. So you can just copy that Yara sig out. And we're going to do a generic glob Yara artifact. So let's go over here, select that. Yeah, what is it called? Windows search Yara. Generic detection Yara globe. I think that's what it's called. I think the name got renamed. So I think it's this one. That looks about right. Yeah, that's the one. So there's a mistake in the slides. It's called generic detection Yara globe. All right, cool. So here we have the path globe. So generic means that it's the same plugin can run on Windows, Linux, macOS, whatever, right? So it's not tied to an operating system. But in this case, we're going to run it on Windows, C Windows temp. So we're going to do it here, C. Now in Velociraptor, you can use / or reverse /, doesn't really matter. This is the path globe, and we can put a star there. So we're just going to look in the temp directory. So what this does is, like the file finder before, we have some conditions that we can use. We can put size limits and so on. And we can put Yara rules and so on. It's a little bit similar to the file finder, probably. You know, but it's more geared towards Yara searches, I guess. So let's copy the Yara search little here, right? And what else are we supposed to do? So we can limit by sizes or whatever. But I think that's all right. We'll just do it real quick. Launch it. There's probably not a lot of stuff in there. All right, so we're doing the same sort of thing. We're now, if you look at the logs, you can see that what we try and do in Velociraptor is try and use Yara to scan a file, but sometimes a file cannot be opened, and so we end up, falling back to NTFS accessor to access it. So you'll see that a couple of times, and so we can see the result. We come back with one row, and we've got a hit, right? So we've got a hit on this file. This is the template. So that's really cool, right? And now, normally in a real thing, you might actually, look at more files or do it a bit quicker. And this is where the size parameters become more important, because typically for the template, it's not very big, so you can limit the size, and then it's a lot faster to do the CR scanning. So we found our templates, right? And we can fetch it. We can get upload file. So let's do the same thing. Copy it, configure parameters, and click the upload hits. And this time it's the same. It will do the same thing, but also fetch the file. And you'll see that we have hashes and so on because we've uploaded it, and the file's collected. So, there it is. We can look at it. Okay, we can actually then look at the data. Let's do that. Use Notepad, open with Notepad. There we go. Right, so this is what the template injection looks like. And you can see that basically this is the Cobalt Strike one. It's got a bit of C# here to load this data. So it's like a reflective loader, and you can see that it creates, it's injecting it. And then this is the actual payload, and that's the beacon, the Cobalt Strike beacon binary that gets injected into whatever, right? So it's decrypted. You can see that there's an XO key and so on. So now we can start to analyze it, unpack it, understand where it's coming from, these kind of things. So we can see that we can use the Yara to kind of identify the compromise, and then extract it and post-process the data. I'm just going to skip this because we're kind of running a bit behind time. The other way of detection, prefetch. So prefetch is, again, a very good forensic evidence source, because it tells us when a binary was run. And as I mentioned before, MS Build is shipped on most systems, Windows systems, but it's not really used very often if you're not a developer, right? So if we ever see MS Build being executed somewhere, then that's a bad sign that it's not supposed to, right? So if we can use prefetch to get evidence of execution, that this thing has executed in the past, right? So if we ran the prefetch, oops, we use the forensic one, and if we can filter the binary name, which is going to be MS Build, right? So then it will just tell us whether MS Build was ever executed on this system. And if we get a hit, then we can say, well, is that reasonable for MS Build to be executed on that system? If it's not, then that's a really bad sign. So that is actually a really strong thing. Now we can do a hunt across all the systems and see, what's happening. I'm not going to really talk too much about the actual prefetch. Actually, I just did want to say this. So this goes back to the point that I made earlier, that it's about sharing the forensic knowledge, right? As you've seen, I've used the prefetch, and I didn't even really explain what it is or why it's there or where it is and how to parse it. And we really don't care about these things, right? What we care about is what can prefetch tell me about the question. Like I mentioned before, it's the high-level question. Did MS build execute on this machine, right? And all I need to know is this thing called prefetch, and it will tell me about it. I don't really need to understand exactly how to parse it and what it means and where it is and how to find it. And this is more about streamlining forensics, streamlining DFIR. So this is what Velociraptor gives us, the ability to kind of leverage this thing and get to the answers quickly. I don't think we're going to skip that one because we're running out of time a bit. Memory artifacts. The next thing I wanted to just show you quickly is how to scan process memory using Yara rules. A lot of, especially that MS build one, for instance, is memory only because they're injecting it into a different process and they're running in memory and they're not actually running on disk. So we've talked about NTFS and how useful that was, and that's great. But now we're looking at more sophisticated attackers that don't have disk evidence at all. So they're all running in memory. Cobalt Strike is a very famous example of that. Here's an example of how, and this is how we actually test this memory scanning ability. We have this tool here that you can get, which is just like a test tool. So we use that to inject. So it is actually Cobalt Strike, but it's not running. It's just it's just designed to trigger the Yara signatures that we use, right? So if we just grab that loader binary, then we can use it to inject this payload into any process we want. So we'll do that for this test. Load up. Come on. So if we just run it, dash help, then you'll see that it basically injects stuff, which is just essentially it's like a binary blob that will trigger the Yara-6. So we use it for testing, but it basically looks like an injected Cobalt Strike beacon. And we just inject it into another process. So let me just start the task manager so I can find, some process to inject it into. And let's click on details. And this is actually what happens using a Cobalt Strike infection, is that the beacon itself is injected into another process. So for instance, like MS Edge, it'll be injected into a browser or whatever, right? And that way we can, it goes on and communicates with its CNC or whatever, but it looks like it's at Microsoft Edge, right? So let's look at the PID here, 10492. 10492. All right, and so what this tool does is it basically will extract the binary blob that looks like the beacon, so it will match the Yara-6, and then it injects it into this process that we told it. So this is how we will prepare the system. And now we're going to try and hunt for this system, right? So this is the screenshot. This is what we did. I use Chrome or whatever, it doesn't matter. The sample is not actually running, but it's still in memory, so it will trigger the detection. And now we can look at how we can do Yara on process memory. So this artifact is an artifact that applies Yara signatures to process memory. So let's do that one. Okay, we'll just choose it and configure the parameters. Now the default Yara rule in this case is a Cobalt Strike Yara rule. You can change it to detect anything else as well, but this default is good. So we'll just leave it for this exercise. It's actually what we want. Now you can limit it to different processes. So it's more targeted, or you can just, go right ahead and just do all the processes. Here you can actually upload the rule from a URL. So it, sometimes Yarrow rules are very large, so you don't want to just like paste them in here, but you can just use them from a URL. And you can whitelist binaries if you want as well. All right, so so this is going to take a while. It's going to go through every process and scan the process memory space. So it is not the same as volatility. It is not looking at the physical memory. It's looking at the process memory of each process. So there's pros and cons with that approach. The disadvantage is that when you're looking at process memory, obviously you can't see kernel memory, right? So if there is a hit in kernel, then you won't see it, right? But the advantage of that is that you don't need to worry about paging or any of stability or any of that, right? You basically just use the dedicated APIs. And so if usually when you use volatility to try and scan processes from a physical memory image, you probably only have, maybe a small percentage of the pages that are actually resident in memory. They're not really in memory, so you can't really scan them. So you don't really have a lot of coverage with that method. But using the APIs, we can scan the running processes and we get better coverage for the ones that we can scan. But if you look at the query log, then you'll see that there's a whole bunch of messages like, I can't get to this process, access is denied. And that's because Windows has this thing called protected processes, where you actually can't really open their, there's a question. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, so the question is, will it create a dump file for each process, or will it look at it at runtime?
No, so it opens it, with it just doesn't open process, and then it looks at the memory. So it doesn't dump it out. It looks at the memory, right?
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, but you need the SE debug privilege, and then some of the processes you can't get to. Some of them don't make sense because PID4, for example, is a system process. You can't really look at that. But some of them are protected as well. And when you do this, if you have an EDR, then sometimes it will, because we've just asked it to scan all the processes, so it will do that. So it will actually hit up LSAS and scan LSAS as well. And if you have an EDR, then that will be an alert. So expect that when you do these things, right? Yeah, so you can see it takes a while because it goes through all the different processes and tries to find, we're going to leave this to go on and do that, but it should find the injected beacon in the process memory. If we're going to be more targeted, we can put a process name here so we can be more targeted, but generally we don't, because we don't know exactly where it is. But we can, so this is not a fast way, but it's okay, safe way. And we do find detections that way. Well, presumably, the fact that it can't get to these protected processes is not a huge deal, because then the beacon can't really inject into it anyway either, because it's still a protected process. So it's not going to be there. So we already know. So it's not really a huge showstopper, I don't think, for this case. Right, we'll leave that to go and see how it detects it later. But once we detected it, then we need to know the beacon config. So the beacon is running in the memory, right? But it's configured to talk to a CNC and so on. And so a lot of the time we really need to know where it's talking to, so that we can pivot and try and find it, stop it, right? So it is actually difficult to know. So the beacon is using a configuration file, and it's encrypted, and you have to parse it from memory, and it tries to protect itself, so it's not so easy. But we do have a Windows carving Cobalt Strike artifact. I'll just show you quickly. This artifact, let's just quickly show you this. It basically tries to parse out the config. And I just want to quickly show you this. I'll just show it to you. But this is it's doing the parsing in VQL, and this is a language, parsing language that's very similar to, if you've ever seen volatility v-types declaration. It's similar to that, but a lot cleaner. So you can actually build like essentially a v-types into the VQL and have like full-blown parsers in VQL. And this is what this is doing, like a whole bunch of parsing and XOR decrypting and all kinds of stuff, right? So it's this one's a pretty complex artifact, and we can target it at a particular process. Let me just see whether we found the detection. So we found it, yeah. So we did the detection before. So the first Yarrow rule just finds the detection, like say, hey, that looks like beacon. But then the next one is like, once the beacon is actually detected, can we parse out the config from it? So it's a much more sophisticated rule. And so, we can see that it was in MS Edge because we've injected it. Oh, and also MS Build had it as well from before. So we use that as well. So now we can parse it out. Okay, so, but just for the sake of speed, let's just detect MS Edge. MS Build. These are the two ones that had it. So we're going to scan less than, so it should be a little bit quicker. But I just wanted to show you the type of information that we get when we're able to extract the config from the Cobalt Strike. This is kind of what it looks like. Anyway, I can show you that here. But it's able to tell us things like, it's still going. We'll come back. Like the CNC where it's talking to, CNC here, user agent, and so the thing about Cobalt Strike is you can change all of these things, so it's very hard to detect it because you can't really write signatures for these things that you can change. All right, we have about like, yeah, we probably could make it half an hour to, or less than that, to do the last topic. We'll just get started with that. Okay, so so far we talked about collecting artifacts. So we can go off, collect VQL queries, collect the artifact, and we have the data. So that's great. But what if you've ever used a query, like querying like the database, right? So you do a query, SQL query, and if you've ever done a really big query that takes a long time, then you would realize that normally when you run a query, well, it goes off to the database. Database thinks about it for ages, and then a bunch of data comes back, right? But that's not exactly how VQL works. VQL is not exactly like SQL. It's not working like that. The way the VQL works is it's asynchronous, and it's like asynchronous means that as soon as a result appears, then the result is passed back. It's streaming the results, right? So it's not like you have to wait and then get the full thing, right? It streams it as soon as it has anything. And you would have seen that before. We sometimes could see like partial results. Oh, here we got some of the Cobalt Strike results, and you can see all of this information here. It's been parsed out of the Cobalt Strike config. Cool. So what if in VQL, instead of having a query that starts gets some data and stops. What if we had a query that never stops? It just runs all the time. And then whenever something happens, it releases some data. And because the VQL is asynchronous, that data will be streamed to the server, right? And this is really what an event artifact is about. So the idea is that we have a plugin and rows are returned into the query based on some events. And they get streamed to the server, but that query never finishes. It just keeps going forever, right? And so these are they're based on events, so we call them an event artifact or event query. And we can use them to create monitoring. So we can tell the client to run the following queries and monitor for stuff based on these queries. And then the data is coming back. So we can do monitoring and we can do response based on that. So let's have a look at an example. We're going to enable Sysmon. Sysmon is a very common tool for enabling, visibility, event visibility, process creation, networks, connections, these kind of things. So for client events, we'll go look at the client events screen here. And this is where we tell the clients to collect certain events. So let's do that. Let's collect the Sysmon event. Now we can, normally when you collect an event, you have to target a label group. So again, those labels that we talked about. So we're going to just collect for all events for now. And we're going to select artifacts, and we're going to choose the Sysmon log forward. So this artifact just forwards all the logs from Sysmon. So it's a pretty simple one. It installs Sysmon, and then it basically uses ETW to read all the events, and then it just forwards them to the server. So so when we set that, we start it. It's going to download the Sysmon binary and config, so it's all ready to go. And then it basically sends it to the client, and off we go, right? So now, if you look at that, the client will start to will install it. So here are the different events that this client is watching for. We're going to select the Sysmon event, and this is a timeline, right? So what we see here is a timeline. So these are all the times, and you can look at the query logs. Event queries have query logs just like other ones. You can see what is happening here, but it's happening with time, right? Because it's a timed line. So you can see that it's installing Sysmon, and then it's going to be able to run it. So all right, so it's going to run it in a second, and then we're starting to get some data fed in, right? So you can see that forwarding responses. So we're starting to forward data from Sysmon. So these are the logs. So it's taken a while to install it, and then it's turned it on and enabled it. And now essentially Sysmon events are being forwarded through into the Velociraptor server. So when we look at the raw data, we can see those events. So Sysmon events look like this, right? They have an event ID and event data, just like logs, right? Event ID 22 is, I can't remember, something. Image, some execution, process ID. Oh, it's a DNS. All right, so query name. So it's just a DNS, and it's telling us which process did a DNS query and that sort of thing. All right, so this is how we forward, just forwarding events. So it's not that interesting, not that exciting, because we're just forwarding the events, but we can do some more interesting stuff. Let's look at how to turn an artifact into a detection. And this is an interesting one. We've talked about the event log modifications artifact before. Remember, that told us whether an event log was enabled or disabled. So when we run it by itself, it just looks at those registry keys and it just says, is it 0 or 1, right? And we talked about stacking to figure out whether it should be 0 or should be 1, but in reality, what we want to know is when it changes. Like it was 0, now it's 1. That's an event, right? And that actually means something happened, right? So how can we figure out when it changes, right? And so we can actually turn this is a normal artifact into an event artifact by using something called the diff plugin. The diff plugin is a special plugin that runs a query periodically and then looks for the differences. Has it changed? So it's really good for telling us when things change, right? So we can run it. This is an example of an event version of that log modification artifact, where we run the same query, so the same keys and so on, but we're looking for when the key was added. So when there was a change in the status of the key. So it was either enabled or disabled, and then we relay that to the server. So all it is, it's just another query. It's just an event query, and we can just enable that. So we can really quickly show you. I'll just quickly show you how that looks. So it's the same thing. We're going to enable the modification one. Oops. Oh, this one. So this is the event log modification one, right? And let's look at the parameters for it. Okay, period 60. For this test, I'm just going to make the period less. So it's doing it more frequently at checking for changes. But it doesn't have to be that fast, because normally for, if you're going to turn off the logs, you're going to turn it off for a little while, maybe a couple of minutes, and then that's enough, right? So if we look at, no, it's this one, right? So we can look at the logs and we can see the query was installed and it's ready to go, right? So now if we go and do the same thing that we did before, enable it or disable it, whatever, and wait a few seconds, then it will look at the status of the logs and decide whether it's changed, and it should trigger the event, right? So it's triggered the event and it's telling us that it's been added, right? So we can see that log's changed. So it's an event, it just happens right now. Now, the cool thing about it is that we didn't need to use anything like sysmon or ETW or anything like that to detect this. This is just because we're doing a diff. So we can actually use that on many, many different things that don't normally have an event way of detecting them, or so it's actually pretty easy to extend that. So we have like 15 minutes and ETW, and we can talk about ETW a little bit. There's yeah, we could talk about it. We've got enough time. We're just going to go real quick over it. So ETW takes that detection to the next level, right? Rather than relying on differences in queries, we can tap into the proper way of notifying about events in Windows. And in Windows, event tracing for Windows, or ETW, is really the framework that is enabling a lot of the logs that are available, or the logging that is available on Windows. And it's kind of a clever system, right? We actually have, you can imagine that if you had, a lot of software would like to log stuff, right? There's all kinds of logging, debug logging, audit logging, and so on. And if everything logged everything all the time, system would run really slow, right? Because all this logging is going to lead to a lot of writing the disk and a lot of I/O and a lot of extra work. So there has to be a way that somehow the admin or something can control the logging, so we can turn it on and off, right? Because it's too much logging, or we're not interested, or we don't care. And ETW is a really good way of trying to control how logging is taking place. And the way it works is this: you have a bunch of providers that are registering with the system, right? Now, each provider can log, but they don't normally log until the system says to them, hey, there is a consumer over here that's interested in your logging, right? So the system here is mediating between provider and consumer and marries them up. So we can see that the provider, so nothing is happening unless somebody cares about these logs. Then the provider can do the logs. So you're not really wasting a lot of, CPU cycle logging pointlessly. You're only logging when someone cares about that. So ETW is a way of kind of mediating this kind of marrying up these providers with consumers. So this is really important to understand. So how does it work? Basically, providers register through a unique GUI, and then basically the provider is sending these different logging events. So let's have a look at the different providers. You can run this command here, and it basically queries the system about all the providers that it knows about. If you run it, it's going to take a couple of seconds, but it will generally well, I'll just show you what a screenshot looks like. It has a bunch of providers and their GUIDs. So providers are identified by a UUID, a GUID, and not the name. The name is more like for human consumption. But these names, these GUIDs, are actually what the system uses to identify each provider. So a provider kind of registers itself with the system and by the GUID. And then we can use the consumer then basically says, hey, I want to listen to this provider. So there is a tool called Web Explorer. I'm not going to download it now because we don't have too much time, but there's a screenshot here. And you can basically look at all the different providers and see which one, gives you the information that you want. So in this case, I wanted to find something that will give me information about DNS queries. So in this tool, I searched for a provider name called DNS, and I found something called Microsoft Windows DNS Client provider with these GUIDs. That looks pretty right. That looks pretty interesting. And then I can look down here and see what kind of events that it generates. So it's kind of like a registration system, and I can use that to discover which log provider I would like to listen to for different functions, right? So for DNS, I'm going to look for this guy. So if I just copy this query, then you'll see that we have in VQL a plugin that is an ETW consumer. So you give it the GUID, and it basically starts to listen for these events. And this is how ETW is implemented in Velociraptor. So in this case, what we're doing is we are getting this. This is the DNS provider, and it gives you a whole bunch of different event IDs, but we're only interested in these event IDs. And we discovered this 320 from here. This is the event I care about. And so this one looks at the DNS data and tells us, oh yeah, there's a lookup to Google or whatever. So I can tell when the DNS queries are happening. Anyway, you can write an artifact to do that and start to collect it, right? The DNS results. So same thing as before, we're going to enable that, but this time we're going to use ETW to do that. And it's called Windows ETW DNS. Okay, so we're going to look for DNS, Windows ETW DNS, right? And I don't think there's any configuration. You can sort of filter by stuff, but yeah, or we can just launch it and see whether we've got any DNS. This one, and we can immediately start to see DNS feeding into the it's using ETW, but it's immediately feeding DNS, and you can see that now. So we've got the. Let me just quickly show you the artifact. So going from this kind of example where we just look for an ETW source of this GUI, but now this artifact is actually a lot more complex than that. And you can see that what it does is it parses the event. So it tells us information about what query type, converting from a number to what it is. Then it does things like enrichment, gets the process information, figures out what process did this query. And then it does things like figure out, where the process is and what's the image name, where is it running from, and hashing it and all this other stuff. So if we look at it's this one. If you look at the results, then we can see that there was a query. This was the query. The answer was that this is the process that made the query. So Velociraptor Sysmon, for example, did another query, right? It's looking up something. So we're actually seeing information. There we go. It's like that. Yeah, Chrome did some querying. So we're enriching that data. Not only are we seeing, you see in the row ETW, we're just getting like a PID. There's a PID, process ID. And then that's all the context that we get. But Velociraptor can take that information and enrich it with information that that is really valuable, because we can now put context around this. This is really the power of VQL, right? VQL can take those sources of information and enrich it with extra information to give enough context to the analyst, so we can see, this was the DNS was, called from these things. So you can see that different processes, Chrome and so on, Sysmon, making DNS queries. So that's the DNS lookup. We can enable it for the whole fleet and collect everywhere. The last, maybe we have like 5 minutes. I wanted to show you this very cool thing, process parent spoofing. And this is something that's really cool, and a lot of people know about it. A lot of people don't know about it. And it's actually kind of interesting because in Windows, for a lot of this detection, a lot of EDRs use process execution logs to determine parent-child relationship. So the idea is like, okay, you have WinWord, and WinWord runs PowerShell. That's really bad. So, maybe a macro executed PowerShell, and that's an alert, right? So you can write a whole bunch of alerts around parent-child relationship. But it turns out that on Windows, parent-child relationship are not very reliable, because you can actually use the API to spoof a parent-child relationship. And that is actually a built-in part of, Windows, right? So there is this tool, which again, I will download it really quick. So it's called Select My Parents. So I'll download that real quick. And it allows you to spoof parent-child relationship. So you can determine, so you can create, you just basically spoof it, right? So the way it works is it just calls the API. Now, I just wanted to point out from 2009, this is the blog post that first kind of was mentioning this thing. I was like, hey, the API allows you to do this. It's kind of weird. So this has been known for years, and it's actually been used by a lot of malware for years. And it's a really common thing because it basically breaks all of the current, assumptions in EDRs about parent-child relationships. I just wanted to do this really quick demonstration. So let me just get process hacker so I can show you the parent-child relationships. Just to quickly download that. Okay. And there we go. Oops. Keep. Yeah, I'll just quickly install process hacker. Where was it? Let's head up. There it is. All right, and then I'll just show you. So process hacker is just a really nice GUI to be able to see all the different processes. And what we're going to do is we can basically spoof the parent. So we can say to this tool, hey, why don't you start whatever under something with a different PID. So in this case, for example, let's say that we wanted to start. So normally if you just run Notepad, then it would be like, your own process is running it. But let's say that we wanted to start process hacker from Velociraptor. So here's Velociraptor running, and the PID is 8372. So let's just, for this demonstration, run select my parent, select, let's, did it steal it? Maybe it stole it. Oh, probably somehow this thing stole it. What is it? I'll just switch that off. Try that again. All right. So this is the tool, right? So select my parent. So we just need to tell it Notepad. We're going to run Notepad, and the PID is going to be 8372. 8372. So when we run it, you'll see in Process Hacker that it looks like Notepad started from Velociraptor. But of course it didn't, right? I just started it from the command shell. Now, if this was PowerShell or something like that, then it's very hard to know whether Velociraptor really started this Notepad or not. And what a lot of people tend to do is they look at it, and especially Velociraptor being a security tool, and they're like, well, okay, whatever. If it's PowerShell, that's probably fine. But it's not, right? And there's actually no way to tell that this is actually the case, right? That Velociraptor did not start Notepad.exe, because it really looks like the parent-child relationship is such that Velociraptor is starting it. And in fact, if we look here at the sysmon execution log, let me just go up. Right, so then we would actually see that where are we? Right at the end. We will actually be able to see that sysmon actually does get confused about it. I've got a screenshot here, so it's probably easiest to show you that from here. Is that when sysmon looks at it, then it actually does show the spoofed version. So sysmon doesn't even see that it's been spoofed either, right? Which is actually quite interesting. So no security tools can look at it and say, hey, you know, that's a spoofed parent-child relationship, but yet everybody depends on it for all the detections. And a lot of the time, that's what Cobalt Strike relies on, is starting their sub-processes from, or it looks like, or spoofing it from, you know, maybe a trusted security tool or whatever. So that's used a lot, you know. It turns out that ETW is the only thing that I know of that allows you to see that. And there is a method that allows you to see a spoofed process. It's kind of indirect, but that's the query, and we can turn it on, and you can have spoof detection in Velociraptor. So it's just an ETW thing, and it's the same kind of thing. Detect process spoofing, right? Same thing. We're going to turn it on spoof. Yeah. And when we launch it, let's refresh that a bit. Right. And then if we do the spoofing again, same thing, then we should be able to see a detection in just a sec for, where was it? There we go. Raw data. Then we should be able to see this detection, right? Notepad. So that's the suspicious process. Notepad. The real parent is this select my parent binary, and the claimed parent is Velociraptor. So we said, and this alert will trigger. Sorry, quick question. There was a question, Pascal?
Yes, again me. So we now could only detect the spoofing while we have this detection running. So
Yeah.
we can't detect that afterwards, right?
Exactly. So if you do a PS list of a running process, you're out of luck. You know what it says is what it is, right? Yeah, it could be spoofed.
Yeah.
You just don't know, right? Yeah, it's an event thing. The only thing that it works because what happens is the ETW Windows kernel process provider, it tells you about process execution, and it's kind of an indirect way, but basically what's happening is that this process ID in the system, so this is the process that generated the event. And the process that generated the event says that the parent is this. Normally they're supposed to be the same because a process creates another process. So it's the parent. So it will generate the event, and it will say in the event that it's the parent, right? So that's normally how it works. But then if it's not the same, that means it's spoofed, right? So it's kind of an indirect way, and it's only really happens as part of this ETW thing. So it's actually kind of an interesting problem because, you know, it is actually really hard to detect this and, you know, these kind of detections. But the interesting thing is, if you do have this detection enabled, then as soon as Cobalt, like, because the actors are using that all the time, right? As soon as they do that, they'll get caught, right? So they're trying to be extra stealthy and they get busted, right? So this is the nice thing about it, is that we can turn it into a detection as well, right? So rather than, you know, because they're trying to be extra stealthy, and normally that would work, but if we have this detection, then they would get tripped. So this happens this happens a lot anyway. So there is other processes that do spoofing like deliberately. That's how UAC works with Elevation. So it does spoof it. All right. So finally, we're a little bit, maybe 5 minutes over, but we're almost there. Yeah. So we didn't cover, like, you know, a bunch of stuff. But at least I gave you a little bit of a taste as to all the different capabilities in Velociraptor. It's not just about forensics. It's not just about collection. It's not about parsing. It's about all of these things. And it has eventing and, you know, all this post-processing analysis. It's got a ton of stuff, detection, identifying compromise in real time. And we can also do remediation, things like that, automation. We haven't talked about a lot of stuff. So yeah, just as a conclusion, I hope I gave you guys a quick taste of VQL and the power that VQL gives. And if you want to try it out, this is our doc site and our GitHub, and jump on our Discord. We're always there, and someone wants to ask any question, and people, you know, people are there to help. We also have a mailing list. So yeah, we ran out of time today, but if you have questions, jump on the Discord and let me know. Well, thanks.
Thank you very much. That was really awesome.